The mother of all talk shows is back. Unleashed, unabridged, uncensored, and unbelievable. Only on Sputnik Radio.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the Airwaves, the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees and you are positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher. In the race for the Democratic Party's nomination, a full-scale identity politics war has broken out, and the woke ranks are handing out obias, isms and ists. The victim is Bernie Sanders, but will Elizabeth Warren's maneuver actually work as we approach the first of the primaries in New Hampshire? And Donald Trump goes on trial for the impeachment and ending of his presidency. Mind you, he's hired the lawyers of Jeffrey Epstein. What could possibly go wrong? I hope he's on suicide watch. That's all I can say. And what about national identity? What about Scotland? Are they going to declare a unilateral declaration of independence? Well, Craig Murray thinks so, and I'll be talking to him in the course of the show. And as Big Ben ticks, if not bongs, towards Brexit Day, a lot of the Labour candidates for leadership haven't quite accepted that we're really leaving. This is the mother of all talk shows. Fasten your seatbelts. It's radio with pictures.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
This is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet and SputnikNews.com. We're on FM in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States. 105.5 are the magic numbers there. And on AM radio across the United States from coast to coast. But uniquely, this is a radio show with pictures, and many of you, probably most of you, are already watching us. 1.15 million people viewed the show before last, and we're determined to keep those numbers in the million-plus range. So if you are watching us on Facebook, on YouTube, or on Twitter, please share with your friends, because we've got a new target now. It's 2 million viewers, plus, of course, an untold number of listeners. Where to find us? Well, on my own Facebook, George Galloway Official, on my own YouTube channel, George Galloway Official, and on my Twitter feed at George Galloway, but also on almost all of RT's portals, RT UK News, RT.com, RT America, everywhere you can find us on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. We'll be talking to the legendary Abby Martin in the United States in just a few minutes' time about the identity politics war that was triggered by Elizabeth Warren in the hope of scuttling, sinking Bernie Sanders and his flagship attempt to seize the Democratic Party's nomination for president to run against Donald Trump, assuming Donald Trump is still standing in November. And we'll be talking to Abby Martin about that too. The allegation is that the mild-mannered and actually altogether woke individual, Bernie Sanders, who was a feminist when Elizabeth Warren was a Republican, supporting Ronald Reagan, that well-known supporter, champion, you could say, of women's politics. Well, at least he liked Margaret Thatcher. Now, Bernie has utterly rejected the charge that he deserves an ist, an ism, or an obia. But Elizabeth Warren gave it everything she could, in association, of course, with CNN. Has it worked? Well, Abby Martin will tell us that. I've no doubt she'll tell us, too, that the impeachment process, which has now begun, the trial in the Senate, is about to begin. People are being sworn in, and President Trump has hired the lawyers of Jeffrey Epstein. What could possibly go wrong? Well, check the suicide watch. That's what I say. So we'll be talking about all kinds of Americana with the television royalty that is Abby Martin. On the subject of royalty, of course, our own ex-royalty is on its way to the United States. Maybe Abby has a point of view on what kind of film and television future the former royal highnesses, Meghan and Harry, now have lying in front of them as they no doubt move into Beverly Hills, although whether they can afford it now that they've been stripped of virtually every penny of public funds here in Britain, maybe she'll have a view on that too. I'll be talking to the Honourable Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Foreign Office chief for a long time here in Britain, who has become one of the most significant voices, striking a discordant note on many of the platforms of the prevailing narrative, on the Skripal affair, just for starters, and on many other things. He's a man, of course, worth reading and worth listening to. But I give you this health warning: I profoundly disagree with his latest prescription, which is this: that Scotland doesn't need another referendum, that the Scottish National Party has the power, authority, and moral legitimacy to simply declare Scotland to be an independent country. Again, I ask Craig, what could possibly go wrong? Craig, rather riskily, prayed in aid the process by which Yugoslavia broke apart. Well, let's hope Scotland doesn't end up like Yugoslavia. So he and I are on diametrically opposite stances on the issue of Scottish independence. So when he comes up, you better fasten your seatbelts. It might be a rocky ride on that subject. And we'll be talking to the French actor Guillaume Rivaud. Guillaume is not just an actor, but an activist. And I'll be asking him what's going on the streets of Paris. Because, well, I don't know, and neither do you, because none of our media ever gives it a minute on the national news. And the newspapers comprehensively ignore it too. We'll be talking to him about his television and film career, which in just 5 years has taken him on to everything from Poldark to Doctor Who, and he's even played King Arthur, the first French actor ever to do so. Not once, not twice, but 3 different times. He's a very fascinating man, one of the most interesting men I've met in recent times. And of course, as we tick towards the witching hour of Britain leaving the European Union, everyone's fixated on whether Big Ben is going to bong or not. I actually don't give a toss whether Big Ben bongs or not, and I'm certainly not going to donate to the crowdfunding to buy a new hammer to hammer the bell to usher us into the future outside the European Union. But I am as committed to Brexit as I ever was. The Labour leadership contenders haven't quite gotten out of that famous river, denial. The leading contender, the Blairite Keir Starmer, appears still to be leaving open the possibility of Britain rejoining the European Union. Good luck with persuading those on and behind the red wall, as was, which turned out to be made of blancmange, that we should rejoin the European Union. And a poll this week showed that almost 2/3 of Labour members still believe that their party policy of promising a second referendum rather than accept the results of the first and implement them was a good idea. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is denial. The donkey derby for the Labour leadership is still proceeding, albeit at snail's pace. Keir Starmer is still the horse in front. A tailor's dummy, I called him last night. I don't know if they call them that in the United States. I mean, he's statuesque. I mean, he's well turned out. The lights are on, but there's nobody home. And the Corbynite candidate, Rebecca Long-Bailey, is revealed in the Sunday Times today to have previously been employed in private finance initiative schemes in the NHS. Now, I'm fully aware that lawyers have to accept the cases that come their way. They don't necessarily have to believe in them, but it's a bit of a damaging blow. Not quite as damaging to the Corbynite cause as the further Sunday Times revelation today that the apostate, the backstabber-in-chief, Tom Watson, is about to become Lord Tom Watson. No other Prime Minister or leader of the opposition would ever have nominated Tom Watson for a seat on the House of Lords. Such was the level of his disgrace. So disgraceful, he might not even now get through the Honours Committee, which scrutinises the suitability of nominees for a seat in the House of Lords. But Jeremy Corbyn, no less, the man whose back Tom was stabbing, has given him a place in the House of Lords, and thus, of course, continued his political life, which might otherwise have been at something of an end. Now, Tom Watson, just when you thought it was safe to get back into the water, Tom Watson is back, and he's back as Lord Tom Watson. Now, the government today announced that they're thinking of moving the House of Lords outside of London to what they presumably consider to be the provinces. Now, I'm not sure that the provinces are up to providing the necessary support services for the House of Lords, hookers, drug dealers, and so on. I'm not sure that the provinces will quite be able to keep their lordships in the manner to which they have become accustomed. So I'll be asking you in a poll, where do you think we should move the House of Lords to? A, York, B, Birmingham, C, history. I vote C myself, but you may have other ideas. Tell me, you can vote on my Twitter feed. Now, there are all kinds of other issues abroad and at home here in London that we can discuss, and I'll be happy to take your calls. I want to make more space for calls this week than we traditionally do. So if you have a pen there, the number, if you're in the UK, is 02077 982 255. If you're in the United States, it's 001 757 744 4480. And you can tweet us, of course, at George Galloway, at RTUK News, or at GG Moats. I discovered to my great pleasure that thousands of you now follow that Twitter account, GG Moats, M-O-A-T-S. I'm particularly interested in the issues of the Middle East. And I note that a summit in Berlin is being held right now as I speak, and that President Putin is there, Chancellor Merkel is there, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is there, and President Macron is there. The plan is to bring the farcical situation in Libya, which would be a farce if it wasn't so tragic, under some kind of control. You've heard me say before, Libya, which was once one country, one state with one government, however good or bad, is now no state at all. It's not a failed state, it's a non-state. It has 3 parliaments, it has 4 governments, 4 prime ministers. But in truth, General Haftar and the Libyan National Army are now in control of almost all of the country. And the Western leaders are determined to stop the general from taking power because they think that he will be another Gaddafi. I'd like your point of view on that. My own point of view is that Libya needs one strong leader and government, just like it used to have. And so I hope this summit in Berlin is not going to, as it were, ossify the balkanization of Libya and halt what would in other circumstances have been a final decision by the Libyan people to have a single state, have a single leader, have a single government. The situation in Iraq remains extremely tense. It's extremely tense in Lebanon. The war in Syria is moving to an end, but significant numbers of people are still losing their lives and their blood and their property to the jihadist fanatics who remain holed up under Western protection in one small part of Libya. As the Russian leadership said today, the war against terrorism in Syria is over. It's not entirely over, but it's very largely over. But the economic rebuilding of Syria cannot be begun whilst economic siege against the country is still laid by the Western countries who failed to overthrow the government in Damascus with their military campaign through proxies like that lovely Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the rest of the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism. So I'm open to your calls, your tweets on all of these subjects and more. It's going to be, I promise you, the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, in the United States, we march ineluctably towards the first of the challenges for the contenders for the Democratic Party's nomination. Cards on the table. I'm a Bernie Sanders man. I was last time. I believe if he'd been the candidate, we'd never have heard of President Donald Trump. He'd still be working with Piers Morgan on a new series of The Apprentice. But he was cheated out of the nomination, and the same people who cheated him are rather keen that he should be cheated again. Thus, I was appalled at the attack launched on Sanders by Elizabeth Warren in advance of the last presidential candidate debate, in which she, in terms, accused Bernie Sanders of being sexist, misogynist, and who knows, maybe some other ists, isms, and obius. The woke like to hand these titles out. The irony is, Bernie was woke decades before Elizabeth Warren was even on the Democratic side of the aisle, when she was still a Republican. Bernie was championing the idea of women candidates, including for the presidency. And indeed, Bernie Sanders even encouraged Elizabeth Warren last time to stand for the Democratic Party's nomination. And of course, Donald Trump goes into the trial process in the Senate So who will face Donald Trump, or whether Donald Trump will be facing anyone at all, is still very much up for grabs. So who better to talk to about it than our very own, the remarkable presenter, writer, activist of the Empire Files, the wonderful Abby Martin, who joins us, I hope, now on Skype. Abby, wonderful to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, George.
Let's start with the Elizabeth Warren attack on Sanders, if we can. To what extent was it warranted? To what extent was it planned with others? And what has been the impact of her attack?
Well, George, you said it best. I mean, we're talking about two people's records of credibility standing up against each other, and one really doesn't hold very strong. I mean, we're talking about a woman who called herself a Republican for 50 years, giving speeches to the Federalist Society, while Bernie Sanders was co-founding the Progressive Caucus, fighting for women's rights, preaching about how a woman should run for president. As you mentioned, 2016, he was trying to get Elizabeth Warren to run. She said no, that's the only reason why he ran. Of course, he proceeded to do dozens of campaign events for Hillary Clinton. All of these things put together make it pretty remarkable and pretty far-reaching to actually imagine that Bernie Sanders would, in secret, with Elizabeth Warren, just say, yeah, you know what, you're never going to win, toots. I mean, come on, let's face it. Joe Biden is openly sexist, has 8 women currently charging him with, sexual advances, uncomfortable touching. He's been called Creepy Joe for quite some time. You don't really hear many think pieces about this. But to what extent was this planned? I think we pretty much are well aware that this was planned for quite some time, George. It looks like it was planned for about a year for Elizabeth Warren to kneecap Bernie Sanders right before the Iowa caucus. And I think she had this plan all along. I think she was really upset Bernie Sanders ran in the first place against her. She, like Hillary Clinton, thought that she was the anointed one, thought that it was her turn, thought that everyone would fall in line and she could just kind of take Bernie Sanders supporters, adopt some of this progressive rhetoric while throwing all of us under the bus, of course, as soon as she got elected. And of course, leaking this story purposefully, right, to CNN, leaking it to CNN and then pretending like, oh, we don't know how it got out. I mean, come on, you leaked this on purpose to kneecap your so-called best friend and most loyal advocate. And you know what, George? I think it didn't do anything. I think it actually backfired tremendously on this notorious liar, and we can get into her record of just lies. But I think that, look at his debate performance. Look at the fact that CNN tried to cynically undermine him in the debate, and he ended up making record donations in that first hour. I think the best that he's ever made in the entirety of the campaign. So I think people see through the cynical stunt. They see through this woke performance art, and they understand the issues, and they understand that Bernie Sanders has a lifetime record of progressive activism and credibility that cannot be undermined by someone that we now know as a snake.
Now, tell us, when's the first test of all this, Abby? When do the people start going to the polls?
In about 3 weeks, we have the Iowa caucus. The California election is actually coming up really soon as well. Bernie Sanders is leading the national polls for the first time. And that's when you see these stunts come out. I mean, Elizabeth Warren is a hardcore political operative here. We can't, we can't really. It's pretty obvious, right, that she's a hardcore political operative and she'll do anything to win. And the second that Bernie Sanders started surpassing her in the polls, we saw these dirty tricks come out. And so I think that it only helped him, George, because people are sick of this.
What, you don't think she's working in concert with Creepy Joe, Sleepy Joe, Sleepy Creepy Joe, and that maybe they'll try and do a double harness, that she'll be the VP pick of Joe Biden. She'll pledge her delegates to him. Is there any truth in that, do you think?
I absolutely think that there was some sort of deal made. Look, Elizabeth Warren kind of rose to credibility in the progressive movement by fighting the bankruptcy law. I mean, Joe Biden spearheaded this effort. And so we were all kind of waiting with bated breath saying, when is Elizabeth Warren going to really knock it and sock it to Sleepy Joe, Creepy Joe in these debates? And instead she turns and kneecaps her friends. So I think that there was some sort of deal made behind the scenes where Joe said, look, I'm considering you for VP, perhaps Treasury Secretary, and come out with this absurd ploy that Bernie Sanders is a sexist. So let's try to siphon as many votes as we can, get a brokered convention. Of course, all of these absurd super delegate rigged convention process here in the U.S., George, as we know from last time that Bernie Sanders got screwed over. The same thing could happen here, and I highly doubt that Elizabeth Warren's going to give her delegates to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I highly doubt it too. Let's switch to Donald Trump for a minute. He's now facing trial in the Senate. Is this just performance art, Abby, or is this a serious trial?
Well, I think, as we know, the Democrats have voted for this near $1 trillion defense budget, given him carte blanche to expand militarism, expand the U.S. empire around the world, and that's exactly what he's done. So what he should be impeached over, of course, is war crimes, what he's done in Israel-Palestine, which is abominable, the Yemen war, this mass starvation, so many things, right? The kids caged at the border. I mean, the list goes on and on, the Muslim ban. Of course, there's such a bipartisan consensus on 99% of all of these horrific policies that he's never going to be impeached for this. So I think it is very astounding that the Democrats have launched this campaign. And of course, you have to understand the timing of this too. Nancy Pelosi handing over the articles of impeachment in the Senate at the same time that Bernie Sanders should be campaigning in Iowa, and while the time is nigh, right? And so having him now try to stay in D.C. and be and have testimony for the Senate impeachment hearing, I think, could also be a way to undermine
another dirty trick. Yeah. How will it go, Abby? He can't be found guilty if the Republicans hold firm, will they?
I think the Republicans are going to hold firm. Look, they hitched their wagon to Donald Trump. I think that in 2016, you saw both parties across the aisle really wanting Hillary to run. You know, we saw the Fortune 500 CEOs, Democrats, Republicans alike, saying, good God, we cannot have this clown in office. But now that Trump has won and has been in office for 2 years, I think the Republican Party was almost on the verge of imploding before Trump really took it away. And I think that now they know they need him. They need this character to hitch their wagons to gin up his base of support to help them win re-elections in their own races. And so I think that to go against the party, to go against Trump would be a big mistake for these Republican candidates. And I think that they know that they need Trump in order to secure their positions. So I don't think we're going to see any Republicans go against this, even if you have clear and blatant evidence, which I absolutely think you do, of Trump breaking the law with grounds for impeachment. You're just not going to see it happen, George.
Now, let's talk about one of the things that he ought to be being impeached for, if impeachment is in order at all. And that's the very clear and obvious act of international terrorism that he carried out in Baghdad just a couple of weeks ago. It's abundantly clear now that the reason given for that General Qasem Soleimani presented a clear and present danger to the United States, its people, its property abroad, that he was planning attacks on embassies. All of that has fallen away now because even the Defense Secretary has conceded that he never saw any such evidence, and no such evidence has been produced. So it was a cold-blooded murder. It was a premeditated, cold-blooded murder carried out by the United States. And that, by anybody's standards, is what people should be talking about. However, it's all gone quiet on the Iran track. Should we be suspicious about that or hopeful about that? Is something going on in the background, do you think?
Well, I think that there's something to say about Trump's first term, maybe playing it safely to a certain extent. Look, Trump has been putting us on the brink of war with Iran since he got elected, hiring these extremist warmongers like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, who've been salivating at the idea of a war with Iran for decades. We have to understand that not only did he dismantle the nuclear deal immediately when he got in, he also added 800 800 sanctions to asphyxiate the Iranian economy. If you look at this compared to the rest of the world, it's just an absolutely astounding amount. I can't imagine what these sanctions are doing. I mean, of course, that's aside from circling around with warships, tens of thousands of military personnel sending unmanned drones in their airspace, and of course, threatening them every other day on this giant psychopathic baby's Twitter account. So all of that aside, the act of war, this clear war crime, violation of international law, taking us to a new level, to the brink of full-fledged war with Iran, this unprecedented terrorist act, like you called it, the assassination of General Soleimani in broad daylight at the Baghdad airport was such a blatant, flagrant act of aggression, such a belligerent violation. It was only because of the Iranian retaliation that was de-escalatory and killed no Americans in response. I think that we're at the moment that we're at today, which is that we're not in a full-fledged war. Now, how is this going to affect Trump in the election? Look, I think Trump ran on being tough on Iran. We have to remember that even though he spoke out of both sides of his mouth saying end the endless wars, he also ran on a war against Muslims, essentially, running on killing terrorists and their families, running on essentially a torture program. And so his base, I think, has actually become emboldened by this measure because they can look at what he did and actually count it as a win-win. They can say, look, he took out a terrorist, right? Because even you have the Democrats conceding on this point, of course, all of the establishment media conceding the fact that Soleimani was a terrorist responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, hundreds of Americans, based on nothing. George, this is literally removing the agency of Iraqis living under brutal occupation.
Yeah, it's the opposite of the truth. Soleimani was the hammer of the terrorists. He was the one fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think that his base will look at this and say, well, he killed a terrorist, right? And he also prevented war with Iran. And they don't understand how much on the precipice of war we still are, George. But I think that what you saw with the Democratic Party establishment and the media establishment, this framing, this limited scope of debate where Iran is the oppressive country, right? And all that was debated is, well, what can we do about it? Trump just did something bad strategically. And we all have to concede the fact that Soleimani is a threat. And if they concocted some bizarre threat that actually, just like WMDs, right, that Soleimani was in fact plotting to attack our embassies, you can bet that the Democratic establishment would line up and support that next drive to war immediately. And not only did they concede with this vote for $1 trillion defense budget, they conceded with all the talking points about Soleimani. So in this next presidential election, if Bernie Sanders does not win, for God forbid, Trump can say, you guys just gave me credibility for my talking points. You admitted that Soleimani was a dangerous terrorist and that we needed to do something about him, right? So they cannot actually go after him about this, George. So Bernie Sanders was the only candidate that actually called an emergency press conference. He took this very, very seriously. He actually tried to use his congressional power in the Senate to try to stymie the executive power to go to war unilaterally. Unfortunately, I think that we all know Congress, again, would line up if they concocted some sort of fake imminent threat. So I think that Americans are sick of this. We saw tens of thousands of Americans in the street opposing this. There's a national day of action this Saturday, January 25th, to oppose what Trump is doing to drive us to war because he added sanctions, again, which is an act of war. And also this all started from the fact that an American contractor died, right? Well, why are there American contractors still there? Why are there tens of thousands of troops still in the Middle East? It is a tinderbox, and it's just a matter of time before something else happens. And that's what I'm worried about. We need to get all troops out, close all bases, and that's the only thing that will bring peace and security in the region.
Now, finally, before I ask you what you're doing these days, let's talk, if we can, about the Israel-Palestine track. Trump has been the most slavish supporter of Netanyahu. He has validated and moved the embassy, the first president actually to do so, though they all promised to do so while campaigning. He has moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, thus bestowing U.S. recognition on the illegal occupation of East Jerusalem, which is, and legally, internationally, will always be Palestinian occupied territory. He validated the Israeli seizure of the Golan Heights and its looting for its oil and gas assets underneath its soil. He went there and has sent his statespeople there to confirm Netanyahu's annexation, or Israel's annexation, of the Golan Heights. Does this mean that the supporters of Israel in the United States, some of them Jewish, but most of them evangelical Christians, that Trump will harvest votes for all of this? Or are Jewish people, at least, in the United States returning to the traditional loyalty that they had to progressive politics, especially with Bernie Sanders being himself Jewish?
That's a great point, George. Yes, as you mentioned, this kind of fascist partnership between Netanyahu and Trump has exposed, I think, the real face of Zionism to a lot of people who called themselves progressives. You have that phrase, I'm liberal except for Palestine. You're not liberal. You're not progressive if you support an apartheid state that's besieging millions of people and holding millions more under a brutal military occupation. I think that that's been exposed for what it is. A lot of the progressive movement has shifted on this issue. You see Bernie Sanders himself back in 2016 could barely muster the phrase disproportionate when it came to the 2014 Gaza massacre. This year, he's talking about withholding aid. He's talking about withdrawing illegal settlements back to the 1967 borders. That's actually something Hamas was willing to negotiate in their new charter. That's pretty dramatic, and that's way farther than any other politician is willing to entertain. A lot of people just have this mealy-mouthed condemnations of the racism in Netanyahu without actually acknowledging that the entire system is right-wing, fascist, and racist to its core, and that the most recent election in Israel between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu was essentially between Trump and Trump. We're talking about two war criminals that oversaw the murder of, thousands and thousands of civilians. So I do think that it is a really strong base of Christian evangelicals who, again, are understanding that Trump is the one who will bring their agenda to fruition. Mike Pence is lurking in the background. But I do think progressive Jews, and also you see the walkouts on birthrights, trips. You have a lot of organizations here that are comprised of progressive Jewish people who are standing up and saying, we do not adhere to this. We do not pledge allegiance to the state of Israel. And this does not speak for Judaism. And you even see Trump's recent executive order that's basically conflating criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism, George. And I was victim to this anti-BDS movement. With my new film, Gaza Fights for Freedom, of course, my open pro-Palestine activism, I was scheduled to speak at the University of Georgia Southern. And I was given a pro-Israel boycott pledge, saying if I wanted to speak there, I had to pledge allegiance and pledge loyalty to the state of Israel. And I just couldn't believe my eyes, because I knew that this was happening in 27 states to independent contractors. I had no idea that this was for speakers at universities. Of course, I refused to sign. And I was dropped from the conference. The entire conference fell apart. Ironically, the conference title was about media literacy. So this is a fear campaign going on. This is something that Trump has exacerbated, and we need to stand up and not cower to these acts of censorship that are blatant violations of our First Amendment rights.
So the document you were asked to sign demanded that you explicitly oppose peaceful boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And if you didn't sign it, you are not permitted to speak on a university campus. Is that right?
That is correct.
Unbelievable.
That is correct. Yeah. 27 states, George, for this happening. And all we hear is kind of this hyperbolic notion of conservatives being censored on campus. Meanwhile, there is such a blatant and egregious act to censor pro-Palestine activism and to conflate it with anti-Semitism and even Nazism. And this recent executive order just dramatically escalates that situation to actually threaten students with expulsion if they do move forward with their BDS activism. And I think that really is a testament to how scared Israel is of this grassroots pressure mounting akin to South Africa, which we know the BDS movement really took down apartheid there. That's the only thing that's working. That's an international movement that is successful. And that's why it has our bipartisan political consensus and Israel so terrified of this. And when you have Sheldon Adelson essentially bankrolling the entire GOP, who's also saying he wanted to nuke Iran, it's a very scary path ahead if we see Donald Trump winning a second term.
Indeed. Now, how can people see your magnificent film?
You can check it out on GazaFightsForFreedom.com. You can rent it on Vimeo or buy a DVD there. I encourage everyone to check it out. I worked with filmmakers on the ground in Gaza filming the Great March of Return. Of course, we know hundreds have been mowed down by Israeli snipers over the last 2 years, all sparked with the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. Incredible film, harrowing footage, and it really just documents the Israeli war crimes and violations of the Geneva Conventions against disabled press, medics, and children that are being wantonly committed by Israeli forces, George.
Your courage, your ability, your star quality, they often leave me speechless. Abby Martin, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother
Thank you
of
so
all
much.
talk shows. God bless you.
Thank you so much, George.
God bless
Bye.
you. Thank you. Abby Martin, my goodness. If you haven't seen her film yet, GazaFightsForFreedom.com or on Vimeo or on the usual platforms. Trust me, you'll thank me for the advice. This, I told you, is the mother of all talk shows. Now, earlier this week, I did one of my now astoundingly successful shorts for RT. When we started these about 22 or 23 of these shorts ago, we had no idea how they would go. Now they've been viewed by something in the region of 12 million people for 23 short videos. Take a look at this one. Our man in Tehran, Rob McCare, Her Majesty's ambassador to Iran, was briefly detained by the Iranian authorities, having been found in the middle of a protest demonstration demanding the fall of the political system there. Illustrating the revolving door between corporate big business and the corridors of power in Westminster and Whitehall, it turns out that Rob McCare, our ambassador in the sensitive spot of Iran, is a former director of political risk for British Gas. Well, I hope he did a better job assessing political risk in the British energy sector than he has done in assessing it in the interests of Her Majesty's government, because he has now put at risk many British interests and many British people in Iran. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, for starters. She's the prisoner being held unjustly in Tehran in an Iranian dungeon, and her position, according to her own husband, has been greatly put at risk by this reckless adventurism by someone pretending to be a diplomat. Can you imagine if an Iranian diplomat or a Russian diplomat had been at a demonstration outside Westminster demanding the fall of the government, the fall of the Queen, the fall of the political system? Well, they would have been expelled pretty damn quick. And Rob McCare can think himself lucky that he has not been so dispatched by the Iranian government. Rob McCare says he was attending what he thought was an open-air vigil for the victims of the disaster of the Ukrainian airliner shot down over Tehran. Well, if he did think he was attending an open-air vigil, he's too stupid to be a British ambassador. If, on the other hand, he was deliberately showing his support for regime change in Iran, or worse, as many suspect, actually involved in the organization of it, the orchestration of it, he's too wicked to be a British ambassador. We've seen this kind of thing before, We've had diplomats from the Israeli embassy interfering in British politics, and it's equally unacceptable when British diplomats are interfering in internal Iranian affairs. This goes against the entire purpose of diplomats. It is the job of a diplomat to be sent abroad to lie for his country, but that stops short, surely, of infandous street activism by an ambassador, no less. One would have expected some of the many intelligence officers attached to British embassies to be involved on the fringes of such activities. But for the envoy himself to go down onto the streets and get caught in a crowd demanding the political overthrow of the government to which he is accredited is reckless stupidity at best and perfidious Albion at worst. The situation between Iran and Britain is now extremely precarious. Demonstrators are outside our embassy in Tehran. Unwittingly or wittingly, Rob McCare has joined us as the tail to the dog in another Middle East misadventure by the United States of America. Perhaps it's time for Rob McCare to return to British gas.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Well, just for the record, our man in Tehran is no more. He is no longer in the country. It's not yet clear what will happen, but my prediction at the end is as good a bet as any. I'm asking you on the poll, where would you move the House of Lords to? A, York, 10% of you. B, Birmingham, 8%. And C, History, 82%. You can vote now on my Twitter feed at George Galloway. Melanie Powell on Twitter says, George Galloway, a true socialist who makes no apology for it, a man who's not afraid to speak the truth. Our politicians and establishment won't tell you. Our establishment are all liars. That's why they hate anyone who speaks out against it and them. Thank you very much, Melanie. Mr. Gossamer says, give the dosh that would have been spent on a Brexit celebration to a useful organisation such as Women's Refuge or something similar would be far more beneficial. And Monetising Dissent says, send the Lords to Derry. They'll give them a very warm welcome. Maybe some fireworks. Phil Taylor says, don't expect mainstream media to report on what's happening in France. Thankfully, we've got YouTube channels keeping us updated on these things and more. And Michael Julian says, would you agree that Iraq's January 24th million-person march led by al-Sadr will bring the US and the coalition to declare game over in Iraq and make a dash for Jordan? Iran will target their bases. And Truth Investigates Ignorance says Hillary Clinton is fully responsible for the Libyans' blood. And Pat Brannigan says Elizabeth Warren's smear has backfired. He has raised more money from her smear, and she has lost money and her place in the polls. Let's take a call. Sean in Stevenage. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey, George, how you doing?
Good, nice to hear from you.
I've got a couple of things. Excellent commentary from Abby Martin, by the way.
Oh, wonderful. She's a real star.
Indeed. Always fascinating to hear cogent observation from people rather than the absolute horse manure that we get from the so-called mainstream media and what passes for news.
Yeah.
The House of Lords, just as an observation, I would consign it to the dustbin of history, but not before they'd spent a few years in Reykjavik.
That's punishment, I must say.
Well, so be it. That's nothing less than they deserve.
Now, let me ask you, though, Sean. Do you think there is a case for a second chamber, an upper house? Because most parliaments have that, to scrutinise legislation, for experts to give their advice on legislation and so on. And if you do think we should have a second chamber, how should it be constituted?
It should be elected.
Elected. That means you've got two cooks in the kitchen. You've got an elected Parliament, House of Commons, and another elected Senate, let's say, or Lords, or whatever you are going to call it. You don't see that as a potential recipe for conflict?
I don't think so. I don't think so. People could campaign based on their experience for doing the legislative, executive side of government rather than the political side of government. And you could then have scientists, engineers, people who would have sense and would understand things like pollution and energy strategy and infrastructure projects, unlike a lot of the so-called elected politicians that we've got. And you may get a very good counterbalance to the political aims that get put forward.
Well, I mean, that's obviously a very cogent alternative. I have known two incarnations of the House of Lords. When I was first elected to Parliament, the House of Lords was, I thought then, as bad as it could get. It was the putrefying corpses of the British aristocracy. I saw them dragged in off the grouse moors to vote to implement the poll tax, which did for Mrs. Thatcher's government in the end. And I looked around, I saw them, these decrepit toffs wandering around. Many of them hadn't been in the building for many, many years, decades in some cases. They had literally come in from the grouse moors. They were wearing their +4s and their ratting jackets. Now, I thought that was as bad as it could get, Sean. But in my time in Parliament, I saw the aristocrats cleaned out of the House of Lords and be replaced by flatmates of prime ministers, donors to political parties, hucksters, shysters, get-rich-quick merchants. And actually, that was worse than the previous hereditary House of Lords that we had before. I promise you, the current House of Lords is truly as bad as it gets.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. The one thing I really want to ask you, given the news about Tom Watson.
Yeah, were you shocked at that?
Do you know what? Not really. Not really.
But I was shocked.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a kind of
surprised.
masochism. This is Corbyn actually going full masochist.
Well,
this is a man.
What I wanted to ask you.
This is a man, Sean, who destroyed Jeremy Corbyn's prospects of ever being Prime Minister. Not once, but twice, in 2017 and 2019.
Indeed.
He stabbed Corbyn more often, more efficiently, more brutally than any other. And he gets put by Jeremy Corbyn into the House of Lords. What madness is this?
So, can you get Jeremy on your show to speak candidly about either what compromises he made and how, or has he been compromised in this last year where he threw his friends and colleagues and supporters like Chris Williamson under the bus, and shikes like Tom Watson, backstabbers, betrayers, but, you know, there's no word low enough for this
strong
bloke.
enough, no. Well, I know that...
he's elevating him to the House of Lords. Why?
Well,
Get
Mr.
him on
Corbyn,
the show, because he's got nothing to lose.
Well,
He's got nothing to lose now. He's not going to be leader again. They're going to destroy whatever legacy he might have thought of taking the party to the left on a more socialist platform. Let's have him on the show to speak candidly about all the backstabbing deals that were done.
Well, it's very powerful, Sean. I know that Mr. Corbyn often watches the show. If he's watching now, he knows the telephone number he can call in. Thanks for that very, very powerful set of points. Let's go to Ontario in Canada and talk to Todd. Todd, welcome.
Good day, Mr. Galloway.
Have our royal family as well arrived in your country yet? Are you going to look after them for us? Are you going to pay for it?
Canada's a pretty safe country. You know, they want us to believe that our Muslim people are the enemy, but some of us are more awake, eh?
Okay, go ahead, Todd. What do you want to say?
So I want to thank you, first of all, for always trying to tell the truth as best you can.
Thank you.
And I want to also say I see you caught in the crossfire because people phone in and go, oh, why you support Palestine? And then you say things that trigger me because you sound like you support Israel. But, of course...
I sound like I support Israel.
Hey?
You're saying I sound like I support Israel?
Well, I think in your effort to tell the truth, right? Some of the things you've said, I can't remember what it was exactly, but it triggered me going, because I am pro-Palestine. Yeah. I mean, do you know about the Havara Agreement?
Well, I've been accused of many, many things, Todd, but I've never been accused until this minute of supporting Israel. And so I ask you to remember, if you can, what it was that triggered you.
I can't remember. It was like about 2 weeks ago, but I just want to get beyond that.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so you know about how many Jews did the Nazis release?
How many Jews the Nazis what?
Released.
Listen, Todd. The Nazi regime set out to annihilate every Jew in Europe. And beyond.
Do you know about the Havara Agreement?
And beyond. Yes, of course.
Do you know about the Havara Agreement?
Yes, of course I do. But this, I now realize where you're coming from. Listen. Fascism, Hitlerism, Nazism set out industrially to annihilate every last Jew in Europe and beyond if they ever got the chance. And I will not allow, I will not allow anyone to obfuscate that point. Moreover, the very same fascism started and would have finished the physical annihilation of one racial, religious, political minority after another. And if it were not for those who stood up to Nazism, and in the first case ourselves, with Canada and other allies in what is now the Commonwealth. No, I'm talking. I don't allow any apologists for fascism or Nazism on the show. So be gone with you, Todd. I now realize how that peculiar comment you made at the beginning of your contribution came to be made. I'm against Israel, but I will defend with my blood, if necessary, Jewish people or any other group of people who are being victimized, not for anything that they have done, but for what they are. And I will not allow on the airwaves anyone who seeks to cloud or obfuscate that matter. So, don't call me back, Mr. Todd, in Ontario. I no longer wish to talk to you. John says on email, how about a series of lectures giving a layman's guide from an expert? 5 to 10 minute lectures on various topics. For example, constitutions of various countries, the pros and cons, and where the power lies, government finance, how it works, and other topics sent in by the listeners. Best wishes, John. I'm not sure about that one, but I like the idea, John, of listeners, viewers sending in suggestions like that. Here's one from me. From next week, I am going to establish a Hall of Fame, and I will make the first nomination. And that Hall of Fame will be comprised of greats, political greats, philosophical greats, scientific greats, cultural, artistic greats. And listeners and viewers are encouraged positively to send me nominations for that Hall of Fame. And when we choose a candidate, and I've already chosen my first candidate, as a matter of fact, that candidate's death anniversary is marked this very week, and I'll be referring to him in just a few minutes or so. So a Hall of Fame is a feature that's about to come up. The idea of 5, not 10, but 5, 6, 7-minute lectures by experts on specific subjects, we'll put it up on the blackboard, and the clever people through the glass will decide whether that's a goer or not. And any other suggestions to make the show even better than it currently is are more than welcome. So thank you, John, for that suggestion. I've got to go to the news now, but I'll be back after the break with the Honourable Craig Murray, and it'll probably be a ding-dong between him and me on the subject of Scottish independence. I promise you, you don't want to have missed it. Let's take the news from Emily Horn.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Goats and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Prince Harry and his wife Meghan will no longer use their HRH titles, His and Her Royal Highness, and will not receive public funds for royal duties. The couple will also no longer formally represent the Queen. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex intend to repay £2.4 million of taxpayer money for the refurbishment of Frogmore Cottage, which will remain their UK family home. The Queen held talks with the couple about their future following the announcement that they wanted to step back as senior royals and divide their time between the UK and Canada. As well as repaying the cost of refurbishing Frogmore Cottage, the couple will pay a commercial rent for the property. However, the rift between Meghan and her father Thomas has not yet healed, with him now accusing the couple of cheapening the royal family by choosing to abandon their official roles. Markle Sr. has been estranged from his daughter since her marriage to Harry. Next, and Donald Trump's legal team has issued its first formal response to the impeachment charges against him, describing them as a dangerous attack on democracy. The document said the impeachment articles failed to allege any crime and were a brazen attempt to interfere with the 2020 presidential elections. The response comes after the Democrats filed their brief for the proceedings. It claims the president has abandoned his oath to faithfully execute the laws and betrayed his public trust and calls his conduct the worst nightmare of the country's founding fathers. Opening statements in the trial will begin this week. Trump is only the third U.S. president in history to face an impeachment trial. The House of Representatives, controlled by the Democrats, impeached the president. The Senate, controlled by Mr. Trump's Republican Party, will decide whether to convict and remove him from office. A two-thirds majority of 67 votes in the 100-seat Senate is required to convict and oust him. But because there are only 45 Democrats in the Senate, the president is widely expected to be cleared. And a missile attack on a military training camp in Yemen has killed at least 80 soldiers. Dozens of others have been wounded in the strike in the central province of Marib. The camp, about 170 kilometers east of the capital, Sana'a, targeted a mosque as people gathered for prayer. Yemen's government has blamed Houthi rebels for the attack, but there has been no claim of responsibility. Officials say they expect the death toll to continue to rise. Libya's warring rival factions are joining major powers in Germany in a renewed push to secure a ceasefire to halt the civil war. The talks follow the collapse of an earlier truce amid recriminations. The conflict pits powerful General Khalifa Haftar, who controls much of the east of Libya, against the UN-backed government in the capital. The summit also aims to extract a pledge from foreign powers to honor a UN arms embargo and to halt any further interference in the conflict. Forces loyal to General Haftar recently blocked oil exports from major ports, a blow to the country's main source of income. Libya has been in conflict since the 2011 uprising, which ousted longtime strongman Muammar Gaddafi. Next, and a state of emergency is being declared in Canada after severe snowstorms hit Newfoundland and Labrador. As much as 30 inches of snow has fallen, leaving some residents trapped in their own homes. The House of Lords, Britain's unelected second chamber, could leave London and move north as Prime Minister Boris Johnson considers plans to burst the Westminster bubble. York and Birmingham are the two cities being considered as the new location as part of a constitutional overhaul to be launched this spring that could also see the House of Commons go on tour. York is reportedly the most likely venue for a relocated upper chamber, as an area of disused government-owned land has already been identified. And finally, the threat of nuclear war may have hung over the Korean peninsula for years, but now the U.S. ambassador's mustache has got South Koreans bristling with anger. Harry Harris, a former Navy admiral who was born in Japan to a Japanese mother and an American Navy officer, has been accused of insulting his host by growing the adornment. His facial hair reminds many of the days of Japanese colonial rule between 1910 and 1945, during which all 8 Japanese governor-generals sported mustaches. Tokyo's rule over the Korean peninsula is a continuing source of resentment in South Korea, whose relations with its neighbor were damaged last year amid disputes over their wartime history. In an interview, the ambassador says he grew the mustache to mark his change in role, and added that he wanted to make a break between his life as a military officer and his new life as a diplomat. He says he couldn't grow taller or get any younger, but he could grow a mustache instead. Well, that's all for Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, the Honourable Craig Murray is a prince amongst men. He is a former ambassador, as I said earlier, but he's also an author, a broadcaster, an activist of the very first rank. And unfortunately, from my point of view, he's also a strong supporter of Scottish independence. So far, so good. There are lots of those. At least 45% of the people of Scotland, at the last time of asking, were in favour of that Scottish independence. But Craig has moved from a position that is held by the Scottish nationalist leadership, that they need another referendum, preferably this year, and that referendum should be held even though it's only 5 years, 6 years since the last one, and that a referendum is required in order for Scotland to leave the Union of the United Kingdom. Craig has gone beyond that. He believes that the SNP have the right already to declare unilaterally Scotland's independence from Britain. I said when he first floated it that it was a very dangerous prescription indeed. Maybe I misunderstood it, in which case we have given the Honourable Craig Murray the opportunity to lay out his ideas on the way forward on what we'll call the Scottish question. Right now, he joins me on Skype. Craig, thank you very much indeed for joining us. If I've characterised your position correctly, please explain it. If I've made any errors, please correct them.
Thank you, George. No, I think that was a reasonably clear exposition of what I've been saying. There is no requirement for a referendum before you become an independent country. The majority of countries in the world actually achieved their independence in the lifetime of you and I. And very few of them had a referendum in order to do so. And the domestic legislation of the country you are leaving is not the determining factor of whether or not you are independent. Westminster can't veto Scottish independence any more than the Soviet Union could veto Estonian, Lithuanian or Latvian independence. Independence is something to which a nation has a right of self-determination should its people wish to determine that right. And the power from which you are seceding can't simply block it by saying, no, you can't have a referendum. Now, of course, I would prefer to have another referendum. But if Johnson won't give another referendum to which the UK state will agree, then we may well find ourselves having to look at alternative ways of going forward. And the one alternative way I have suggested is that we convene a National Assembly based of every Scot who has been elected in a proper election at a national level. So that would include MEPs, MPs and MSPs. You convene them all together as a National Assembly, and that National Assembly moves to repeal the Act of Union. We could then follow that up by having a confirmatory referendum, but a confirmatory referendum held after we have declared independence. And that's a process which would be perfectly in line with international law and would be quite in line with the practice adopted in most states which have become independent, where it's their local legislature which has made the declaration.
There are major differences, of course, between countries leaving the former Soviet Union, which had held them as part of the Soviet Union, perhaps against their will, certainly without their authorization of that status, and Scotland, which not only is a voluntary member of the United Kingdom, but as recently as 5 years ago, confirmed its wish to remain within the United Kingdom. The Soviet Union could be said to have been holding Latvia in bondage. No one can credibly claim that Britain is holding Scotland in bondage because Scotland voted to remain in the Union just 5 years ago.
A great deal has changed in that 5 years. And of course, Scotland had two referenda which had conflicting results and which had a similar level of turnout. They had had one referendum in which it voted to remain part of the United Kingdom, It subsequently had a second referendum in which it voted to remain part of the European Union, and did so by a much higher majority than it voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, it's two national referenda which, had they remained compatible, would each have a valid result. But unfortunately, what has subsequently happened is, of course, it's impossible to honour the result of both referenda. So which do you honour? Well, the obvious answer is to have another referendum to find out. But Boris Johnson is denying us that. I think there is a genuine a genuine comparison between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. I think they were both empires at the last gasp, empires which were falling apart. And I think the United Kingdom is an empire which is falling apart. And I think, sadly, my own view, and I know this is one of the very few subjects on which we disagree, but my own view is that the United Kingdom has to be destroyed because the imperialist and racist attitudes which underlie so much of the British establishment and British politics will only actually really be scrubbed out if you dismantle the institution of the United Kingdom itself.
Of course, Scotland was a leading edge of the British Empire, far from being a colony of Britain. Scotland helped to colonise a quarter of the people of the world and was often in the front line of murdering them and holding them down. Yet you characterise Scotland as a victim of an empire when in fact it was a co-criminal in that imperial adventure.
Well, there's a great deal of truth in that, but many Scots were implicated in the crimes of empire. But equally, the Roman Empire eventually had, for example, African emperors. But that doesn't mean that Africa, or the North Africa, was not a colony of the Roman Empire. Of course it was. But the fact that, you know, elites and others and military people are co-opted into the ruling of empires, something which has happened in empires everywhere, always. It does. Stalin was a Georgian, not a Russian, but he was a part of the Russian, later Soviet empire. Empires co-opt people from the periphery into the metropolitan. That's how empires work, always has done. It doesn't mean Scotland was not effectively a colony.
So, yeah, I want to ask you that. To be clear, you say that Scotland is a colony, albeit one that voted just 5 years ago to remain in Britain.
Yes, that is absolutely my position. My position is that Scotland has been colonised, and like all colonies, Scotland has had the wealth sucked out of it for centuries and taken down to London. If you look at the comparative economic state of Scotland compared to similar countries like Ireland, Denmark, Spain, Norway, compared to countries of a similar size and similar geographical location, Scotland is far poorer. And that's because talented Scots, like your very good self, are sucked down to work in London. We have, at the time of the Treaty of Union, Scotland had a population that was 1/3 that of England. It now has a population that is 1/10 that of England. And the reason for that impoverishment and the reason for that depopulation is one of colonial dominance.
Now, these are very important and interesting topics, but let's move forward from the Roman Empire and the points I made, equally historical, to the current. I'm with you, by the way. Scotland has the right to hold a referendum any time that it chooses. If it chooses too often to do so, it will be laying itself open to the law of diminishing returns. If you go too often to the well, you might find there's less to drink. But no one but Scotland can decide when to exercise its right of self-determination. So I'm with you on that. But you must see the strength of the argument that Johnson didn't make but ought to have made, that, well, we of course can have another referendum, but not this year, because Britain is still in the process of withdrawing from the European Union, as it was mandated to do by the 2016 EU referendum. And once we've got that out of the way, we'll know better what the shape of Brexit Britain will be, what its prospects will be, what its relationship to the rest of the world will be, and that will be a better, more informed time to have a referendum. Moreover, he should have said to Nicola Sturgeon, you'll be able to stand for election for the Scottish Parliament in 2021 on the platform of demanding a new independence referendum. And if you get a majority in the Parliament, then we'll sit down and negotiate the terms of a second independence referendum. Johnson didn't make that argument, but if he had, would you have seen any force in it?
I would see very little force in it. In the first instance, there have been 4 national elections in Scotland since the independence referendum, and the SNP has won every one of those elections. There's been a pro-independence majority elected in every one of those Scottish parliamentary or UK parliamentary elections, and the SNP were elected to a majority in the Scottish Parliament together with the Greens, who had the same policy, under a proportional representation system, were elected on the platform that if there were material change in circumstances, and it was made perfectly plain that that meant if the UK leaves the European Union, then there would be a second independence referendum. So we already have a parliamentary majority in the Scottish Parliament elected on that basis after the last independence referendum. So you're asking to repeat a mandate you already have. But the other point is, of course, that your argument doesn't get around this problem of the conflicting referenda. And Scotland voted very strongly in favour of leaving the European Union. Now, my own view is that the SNP went down a complete blind alley, because I don't believe that the SNP had any right to participate in a campaign to keep England in the EU. Because if you believe that Scotland has a right to stay in the EU because Scotland voted to stay in the EU, you have also to believe that England and Wales have a right to leave the EU because they plainly voted to leave the EU. And I think for years these waters have been muddied by the SNP, instead of talking about independence, wasting time attempting to keep the whole of the UK in the European Union, which was anti-democratic, which they had no right to do, and which you believe in Scottish independence, if true believes in Scottish independence, would think that it's no business of Scotland to try to thwart England's desires for a separate foreign policy for England.
Now, let's look at the practicalities if your prescription was to be followed. I know that it's common ground between us that if Scotland is to become an independent state, it should be done peacefully and calmly and without acrimony and with a consensus that is the best way forward. Plainly, no such consensus currently exists. I was speaking in East Kilbride last night. There were well over 300 people in the hall. I laid out my views, which are entirely contrary to yours. They were resoundingly supported. It's clear that a very large number of people in Scotland, whether more or less than 50%, who knows, but a very large number of people in Scotland do not want to leave Britain. If you were to unilaterally declare yourselves independent of Britain, you think that would not be contested by significant numbers of people in Scotland? And if it were contested, that would be the end of any hope that this could be done peacefully and calmly, wouldn't it?
You can contest things in a peaceful way. I mean, my own view is we're going to end up having to have a referendum. Whether in order to get that referendum, we have to declare independence first, then hold our own referendum because the UK state blocks it, or whether we could have one first is, a matter of the position we're forced into. But there does ultimately have to be a test of public opinion, and I perfectly accept that. And I also accept, that there is a strong unionist tradition in Scotland, some aspects of which are British nationalist in not the most pleasant way. I'm sure the people you spoke to were coming from the socialist brotherhood and solidarity side of that tradition, which frankly is a rather shrinking base, because the vast majority of the membership and voters of the Labour Party in Scotland have defected to the SNP. These are debates we want to have, but we can't be stopped from having them, stopped from all movement and stopped from independence simply by Boris Johnson saying so.
You think if you have a referendum to leave Britain, that this time you'll get a majority? Because all those parliamentary stats that you rolled out are, of course, all accurate, but they don't change the fact that in no election has the SNP gained more than 50% of the vote. In fact, more people in Scotland voted for Brexit than voted for the SNP in the current Scottish Parliament. You think things have so changed that this time the Scots would vote with a majority in a referendum to leave Britain?
Well, it's true numerically more people voted for Brexit, but that was on a much higher turnout. Far less people voted for Brexit than voted for Scottish independence in the two referenda, which were on comparable turnouts. I do believe, I'm actually extremely confident that independence would win in the referendum. We started the last referendum campaign on between 30 and 32% in the polls. Over the course of the campaign, we finished on 45%, 46%, and that's a 14% gain during the course of the campaign. I fully expect to see a gain of a similar magnitude again, and we only need a very small gain to get over the line. People have had in Scotland, people do not vote Tory. There's about 1/3 of the population is the absolute maximum the Tory vote would be, and it generally settles at about a quarter, which is about where it was last month. And we just don't want to keep being ruled by the Tories. And the alternative to independence, unfortunately, is continuing Tory rule. Decades of Tory rule we've been through. We have minimum of 5 years more Tory rule to come, and possibly more after that. The only way for Scotland to actually get a government it votes for is to become independent.
Lastly, to whose responsibility is it that the Scottish National Party have made these strategic errors? You see, I listen and follow much of what Jim Sillars says on this subject, a man I greatly admire. And Alex Salmond, before Nicola Sturgeon, was the main leader of the nationalist movement in the country. Do you hold Nicola Sturgeon responsible for the strategic error that you referred to on the issue of Brexit?
Yes, I do. In my view, Nicola Sturgeon's leadership is insufficiently focused on independence itself and is focused much more on other issues, in particular the European Union, also in, if you like, maintaining the SNP's powerful position as a party within the devolution settlement rather than going hell-bent for independence, and also on various issues of identity politics with which the SNP has been very keen to identify. There seems to have been a move to position the SNP as the favourite party of the Guardian newspaper rather than actually a party that campaigns for independence. And I do believe that the SNP needs new leadership much more focused on independence itself.
Well, of course, I recognise much of that, but the people I spoke to in East Kilbride last night would have the absolutely opposite view. They would say this: when the SNP came to power 10 years ago, if they had spent more time picking up, emptying the bins more efficiently, maintaining Scotland's education system and its health system more efficiently, more people might have been prepared to trust them with state power. But as you and I both know, Scotland, whose education system was once famous throughout the world, now has a worse educational record than England, God forbid. Its health service in a more parlous state even than the English health service. And as the union that organises the bin collection pointed out in very powerful pictures and video last week, even in Nicola Sturgeon's own constituency, they can't pick up the garbage efficiently. They have failed on the bread and butter issues because of their obsession with constitutional matters. That's the view that's widely held in Scotland.
And it's a view that's widely pushed by the media. I'm genuinely not sure it's true. My own view is that these are managerial issues, and that whoever is attempting to manage public services anywhere in the UK under a Tory government is going to struggle with the dreadful financial restrictions of austerity, and there are going to be problems. The SNP would argue that they have managed these things better. But my own view is that neither the Labour Party nor the SNP are full of people of ill will or of particular competence one over the other, and that everybody is attempting to do their best. And I think arguments for managerial competence, which both sides argue strongly are in their favour, are a distraction and an irrelevance. And for me, this is the trap of devolution. If you accept the devolution settlement and you become, in effect, managers of austerity, because you can only work with what the Tory government give you, and you have to implement cuts the Tory government force upon you, then you are going to become subject to these kinds of criticism. The only way out of that trap is to give up on devolution, which is frankly a blind alley, which has sucked the energies of the Scottish political class. So you have to give up on devolution and look to actual independence. And I want to make one point to you quite strongly. Personally, I'm not decrying. I know, of course, health services and sanitation and things are terribly important. But for me, myself, I'm much more interested in nobody being able to send our children to fight and die in illegal wars of imperial occupation than I am in how often the dustbins are emptied.
Yeah, of course, that's a powerful point. It's also worth making the alternate point, though, that Scotland has managerially failed under the SNP, despite having more public money per head, per year to spend than people in England have. £1,702 per person per year. So the Scottish government's got more money, even from the Tories, than local authorities have had in England, but their services are worse.
I'm genuinely not convinced the services are worse. I mean, having moved back permanently to Scotland 5 or 6 years ago, the services are definitely better here in Edinburgh than they were where I was living before in Ramsgate, and the health service is definitely better here, purely from the experience of me and my family in getting doctor's appointments, getting into hospital and all that kind of thing. I actually don't recognise the picture which you're painting, and I know it is a picture which the media work very hard on painting. I genuinely don't think there's that much difference. I really don't. I think the claims that the SNP are the greatest managers of public services and managed to mitigate the problems fantastically are overblown. What is true is that we have managed to keep free prescriptions. We've managed to keep no university tuition fees for our students. We've managed to have free social care. All those things are much, much better than they are down in England and reflect a consensus, a much more left-wing consensus in politics here about what the state should be providing. An awful lot of what the Labour Party was promising at the last election is what we already do here in Scotland.
Honourable Craig Murray, thanks for your contribution. I'm sure it will spark ideas and arguments for the rest of the evening. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Thank you. Now, where would you move the House of Lords to? A, York, 11%. B, Birmingham, 7%. That's down 1. What's Birmingham done wrong? C, History, 82%, up 1. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. That poll closes at 9 o'clock. About 2,000 of you have voted so far. We want to get everyone on the board as far as we can. So please let me know on my Twitter feed what you think we should do with the House of Lords. And let me know what you think about Craig Murray's argument for Scottish independence. I'll lay out my own views on that subject later in the final hour. But as always, we have a feature called On This Day in this week in history. In 1966, on this day, the only daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, became the country's leader. She was Indira Gandhi. She subsequently won general election victories in 1967 and 1971. Her role took in the 1971 conflict with Pakistan, which created Bangladesh. And then in 1975, she was convicted of corruption and banned from office for 6 years. She refused to resign and in 1977 lost the general election, but returned to power in 1979. In 1984, Mrs. Gandhi ordered the attack on the Sikh Golden Temple in Amritsar. It was aimed at flushing out separatist militants pursuing self-rule for the Punjab. 2 months later, she was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards. Her eldest son, Rajiv, succeeded her as Prime Minister, but he too was assassinated in 1991. On this day in 1990, police in Johannesburg, armed with batons and dogs, broke up a demonstration against the English so-called rebel cricketers who defied a ban on playing in then segregated South Africa. Several hundred protesters, many waving placards saying apartheid is not cricket and ban racist tours, had gathered in the arrivals hall at Jan Smuts Airport to wait for the 15 English mercenaries led by the former captain Mike Gatting. This came against mounting speculation that Nelson Mandela was about to be freed from prison after 26 years. The tour was doomed to failure. It was dogged by protests, and after 25 days, it was called off. Among today's birthdays of the famous is Edwin Eugene Aldrin, better known as Buzz Aldrin, the second man to set foot on the moon, and he's still alive. He's 90 years old today. 2 days previous to this, in 1961, on January the 17th, the first Prime Minister of the Independent Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was executed, murdered by secessionist Katangan forces backed by Belgium. After a mutiny broke out in the army, Lumumba had turned to the Soviet Union for help. The chief of staff of the Congo army was Mobutu Sese Seko, who, supported by Belgium and the United States and the United Kingdom, had deposed the democratically elected government of Lumumba. Mobutu installed a government that arranged for Lumumba's murder in 1961 and continued to lead the country's armed forces until he took power directly in a second coup in 1965 to become the country's military dictator. Years of murder, grand larceny, and darkness descended on the Congo, or Zaire, as the dictator renamed it. Following the assassination, the murder of Lumumba, who was widely seen as a martyr for the wider Pan-African movement, in 2002, Belgium formally apologized for its role overseeing the assassination, the murder of Patrice Lumumba. Now, he's going to be my first inductee of my Hall of Fame. And I'm going to talk about him in more detail next week. I may even have an expert to talk to about him. But in short, here's my view. Patrice Lumumba was the greatest ever African leader. He would have become the leading force in the unification of Africa and the expulsion of the remaining imperial powers there. Patrice Lumumba was a truly great man. I argue the greatest of all African leaders. And I shall adumbrate my reasons why on the show next week when I, taking advantage of my position as the head teacher here, make him the first member of our Hall of Fame. And finally, on this day in 1991, the mother of all battles, Marek, began as the US, the UK, and its allies sent hundreds of airplanes on bombing raids into Iraq. The ramifications are still being felt today. A day later, on January the 18th, Iraq retaliated by firing Scud missiles into Israel. Now, myself and my friend Ron Mackay were there in Jerusalem, in the American Colony Hotel, when those Scuds fired by Iraq began to land. And we were in the Gaza Strip, on the roof of a boarding house, then the only boarding house in Gaza, when other missiles arrived from Iraq. And I shall never forget the feeling that we were perhaps witnessing the beginning of a convulsion, a conflict that could be world-changing, life-changing for everyone involved. And that's exactly, of course, what happened. Because the war which began on this day in 1991, that war is still being fought today. The attempt of the imperial powers to dominate and even occupy Iraq and break it up as a sovereign Arab country is still continuing today. If not for the war in 1991, there would have been no sanctions. 1 million Iraqis killed by sanctions, more than half of them children, would still be alive. And if those sanctions and that war had never happened, the second devastating invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 would not have happened either. And if that war had not happened, Iran would not be the power in Iraq, and indeed beyond Iraq, that it currently is today. And if it was not, we would not be living in fear of a Western war with Iran. And all of this began in 1953. We threw a pebble into a pond in 1953 when we overthrew the democratic government of Iran exactly by the same tactics as we overthrew Patrice Lumumba, and that pebble that we threw in that pool has become a tidal wave, in whose wake fanatic extremism has multiplied around the world, and millions have died or had their lives utterly wrecked and ruined. Think if you're an Iraqi. You've lived through that war in 91, the sanctions which killed your children until 2003, the invasion and occupation which took place in 2003, the consequent eruption of Al-Qaeda and its metamorphosis into something even worse called ISIS, then the battle against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and now the current crisis between the United States, Britain, and other allies, and the sovereign government of both Iraq and Iran. How many decades must some people exist before they're allowed to live in peace? That was on this day. I hope you think it was worthwhile. The poll is about to close at 9 o'clock. More than 2,000 have voted. York is still the favourite relocation point, but only 11% of you want to move the House of Lords to York. Only 8% of you want to move it to Birmingham. If I was in the House of Lords, I'd definitely prefer to go to Birmingham than York. The food's better, for a start. But 81% of you support my own view that it's time to consign the British House of Lords to history. 81% of you. Let's take a call from one of my many old stamping grounds, Hillhead in Glasgow. Stephen is on the line. Stephen, welcome.
Welcome, George. How are you, George?
By the grace of God, I'm good. What would you like to say?
I wish you were back in Hillhead and back in Scotland, representing the Scottish people.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're
I appreciate that.
Here. You're a legend, George. And I'll tell you something else. I went, my wee friend Paul Bainey last night says, I'll take you for a wee run, he says, Stephen, out to Galloway. I thought it was a mill of Galloway we were going to. We ended up going to the mouth of Galloway.
Wow.
In East Kilbride. I was there last night.
Did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy it?
I loved every minute of it.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that. I appreciate it.
And I tell you what, there's a lot of good speakers in there, George. But the only thing that disappointed me was we're on about Palestine, Jerusalem, and Iraq, and all these other things. But we've got a lot in Scotland. You should stick to what's going to happen in Scotland. There's always going to be troubles in the West and in the East and all these foreign countries. But we'll need to eradicate the SNP out of Scotland because they're putting us in the gutter, George.
Well, I'll tell you what, Stephen. Of course, by eradicate, you mean democratically eradicate, to defeat them.
Yes,
I'm ready for that, and I have been all along. I have opposed the SNP all of my life, and I oppose them now no less. Now that they pretend to be a progressive civic nationalist movement, I oppose them just as I did when they were a very different variant of nationalism back in my youth. I'm just against them. I'm against the idea of breaking up a small island of English-speaking people with a common culture, with common economic interests, a common language, who read the same papers, magazines, watch the same television, watch the same films, listen to the same music, are married to each other, have been together for 300 years, and I'm against building a wall along the border between England and Scotland, because that ineluctably would be what would have to happen. If Scotland joined the European Union with its free movement of cheap labour rules, and England and Wales had left the European Union and stopped that free movement of cheap East European labour coming into England. So I'm ready, Stephen. I offered myself to the so-called Scottish so-called Labour Party years ago. I offered to help them defeat the SNP. I don't know anybody yet. I've not met anybody yet, except maybe Brian Wilson, the former Labour MP, who's as good at fighting the SNP as I am. But the so-called Scottish Labour Party completely ignored my offer. So I'm going to do it on my own, Stephen, with you and with the hundreds that were there last night. I'm going to fight the SNP. I'm going to fight the idea of breaking up this small island. Last word to you, Stephen.
Well, me and my pal Paul over at Ibrox are 100% behind you, and I wish there was more folk like you, George, to come back into Scotland, come out of London, come in here, and you should be the first minister for Scotland, and fight for the common people. We've had enough of this Tory in here, we've had enough of that SNP, we've had enough. Come back to Scotland, George, and fight for us.
All right, you've convinced me.
Come back to Hillhead.
You've convinced me. I'll speak to the wife after the show. Thanks, Stephen, very much indeed for that. John's in Glasgow on the same subject. John.
Hi, George. I'm glad you won't tolerate people being victimised, because it feels like we're being victimised all for being Scottish by Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah, well, you know, the issue of franchise is important. I didn't get the chance to ask Craig Murray about that. Why didn't I have a vote, John? I'm as Scottish as Nicola Sturgeon is, but I didn't get a vote last time.
Well, neither did I, because it was in Germany.
Exactly. The idea of breaking up a country is not a small one. It's arguable even that you need a threshold. You need a 60% majority. That's arguable. What is not arguable is that someone from Poland living in Scotland can get a vote on Scottish independence, but someone like me or you who are working outside of the country are denied that vote.
That's right. But I was also interested to hear Craig Murray say that he was interested in dismantling institutions. And while we had a referendum in '97 which was overwhelmingly in favour of a Scottish Parliament and devolution, what we got was Holyrood and 129 MSPs, which was the brainchild of Tony Blair and Donald Dewar. When the people voted for devolution, it was a bit like the Brexit vote. People then said, well, they voted for Brexit, but they didn't say what kind of Brexit they wanted. And when people voted for devolution, they didn't say what kind of devolution they wanted and gave a blank cheque to Tony Blair to set up Holyrood and 129 MSPs. Now, I'm going to say something radical here, George, which is that you won't hear from any of the parties in there right now, which is that it should be abolished and demolished and everybody in it turned out onto the streets.
But how would that solve the problem that we now have? That would actually make the SNP stronger, John.
No, because we have the original Parliament of Scotland. The true Parliament of Scotland still exists. It's hidden away behind St Giles Cathedral. It's the oldest Parliament hall, debating hall in the United Kingdom. There should be one class of MP in this country. One class of Scottish MP, not MPs who go to Westminster and MPs who go there. That creates division, and it's part of the problem. We should have one class of MP. We are losing the number of MPs representation down in Westminster because of these 129 political pygmies in Holyrood. We're now supposed to go down to 52. We had 72. After the First World War, this country had 74. We should have 74 Scottish MPs elected on proportional representation who are members of the Scottish Parliament, who administer the devolved powers and sit by right of their membership of the Scottish Parliament in London.
Very interesting and radical, as you promised us. Thanks very much, John, for that. Bobby is in California. I hope he doesn't want to talk about Scotland as well. Bobby.
Hey, how's it going, George?
Nice to hear from you. What would you like to talk about?
Well, we left off over the Iran and United States issue last week when I spoke with you.
Okay.
In regards to the issues, so what I wanted to bring up is, I mean, I have conservative values in terms of my political stance, but I've been pretty much alienated by my own party because I'm an Iranian. So I feel almost like a pariah.
Really?
Because I have conservative values which I want to uphold for my family and I. But I also see that the progressive movement is defending me as an Iranian. So I'm stuck in the middle of who do I need to vote for, or who do I need to choose to give us equality?
Well, let me ask you that question. Donald Trump is leading a campaign of 800 separate sanctions against your country, causing a great deal of suffering and death there. And he's on the brink, it seems, constantly of sending some of his shiny hardware in the direction of your country. And yet, despite being a conservative, you're going to face a real dilemma as to whether you give him your vote in November. So, have you reached a conclusion on that yet?
So, my conclusion is I'm probably going to vote for Bernie Sanders because, I mean, at the end of the day, Trump ran a campaign against endless wars, and I believed him.
Yeah.
And when he did this, it kind of showed the true colors of the chameleon.
Yeah, except I agree with that, absolutely. But one should put it in this context that he hasn't started any new wars, but he has continued the wars that previous administrations had launched, except in the case of Iran. He seems to have an absolute blind spot about Iran. And I still believe, Bobby, that Hillary Clinton would have taken us into war in Syria, never mind Iran.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's a sticky situation in terms of, I mean, another 4 years of Trump is really not something that I'm going to promote because of you cannot trust the guy.
Absolutely. Look, Bobby, I need to press on. It's good to talk to you again, and don't be a stranger. But I've got to squeeze in another American, Samuel, in Florida, before the break. Go ahead, Samuel.
Hi, George. I wanted to call and talk about Abby Martin's film, Gaza Fights for Freedom.
Yeah.
I went ahead and purchased it because I've been a fan of Abby's for a long time, ever since her Breaking the Set days on RT.
She
and,
was wonderful in that. Wonderful. A big loss to us, yeah.
Yeah, and but her work with Empire Files has been fantastic. It's just been a great continuation.
I know you don't have royalty there, Samuel, but if you did, she'd definitely be the queen, don't you think? She is in a different class to everyone else.
Yes, I would consider her the queen of leftist progressive politics.
Yeah, she'll probably not thank us. She'll probably not thank us for this, but that's how both you and I feel. Anyway, sorry, go on, Samuel.
No. If anything, I think she would like it. I mean, because she's a strident anti-war voice, and that's what we need more of.
Yeah.
And especially in our countries, we are the net exporters of arms. I mean, I know that you know that the U.S. is.
Yeah, we do a fair bit of it ourselves, Samuel. You're certainly ahead, but the British sell as many arms as they possibly can, and they're not very particular about whom they sell them to.
No. I knew about the scandal with the BAE and the atrocities that are going on in Yemen right now, and how both of our governments.
Well, that's right.
I mean, mine even more so.
Because you're bigger, but we are co-criminals in the Yemen, And just a throwback point. I vividly remember Scottish soldiers in the service of Empire shooting down the Yemeni people in the Crater district in Aden. I vividly remember it in 1967 when the Beatles were #1 in the charts. We had Scottish soldiers with bagpipes and kilts shooting down the natives in Aden. That's why I find it so difficult to accept the idea that Scotland is somehow being colonised by the Empire. Actually, Scotland was very much a co-beneficiary of and co-criminal in the Empire. Last point to you, Samuel, then I've got to go to the news. Go ahead.
I just got to say, as an outsider, I agree with Scotland basically being co-opted into the crimes of the empire. But that's how, again, empires work. They lure you in with power, and that's how the system continues to thrive. So.
Okay, Samuel, thanks for the call. Don't be a stranger. Call any time. I've got to go to the news with Emily Horn, but in the next part of the show, as well as taking as many of your calls as we possibly can, I'll be talking to a truly extraordinary Frenchman, Guillaume Rivaud. Stay tuned to the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Fios TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold, Goats, and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
Prince Harry and his wife Meghan will no longer use their HRH titles, His and Her Royal Highness, and will not receive public funds for royal duties. The couple will also no longer formally represent the Queen. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex intend to repay £2.4 million of taxpayer money for the refurbishment of Frogmore Cottage, which will remain their UK family home. The Queen held talks with the couple about their future following the announcement that they wanted to step back as senior royals and divide their time between the UK and Canada. As well as repaying the cost of refurbishing Frogmore Cottage, the couple will pay a commercial rent for the property. However, the rift between Meghan and her father Thomas has not yet healed, with him now accusing the couple of cheapening the royal family by choosing to abandon their official roles. Markle Sr. has been estranged from his daughter since her marriage to Harry. Next, and Donald Trump's legal team has issued its first formal response to the impeachment charges against him, describing them as a dangerous attack on democracy. The document said the impeachment articles failed to allege any crime and were a brazen attempt to interfere with the 2020 presidential elections. The response comes after the Democrats filed their brief for the proceedings. It claims the president has abandoned his oath to faithfully execute the laws and betrayed his public trust, and calls his conduct the worst nightmare of the country's founding fathers. Opening statements in the trial will begin this week. Trump is only the third U.S. president in history to face an impeachment trial. The House of Representatives, controlled by the Democrats, impeached the president. The Senate, controlled by Mr. Trump's Republican Party, will decide whether to convict and remove him from office. A two-thirds majority of 67 votes in the 100-seat Senate is required to convict and oust him. But because there are only 45 Democrats in the Senate, the president is widely expected to be cleared. And a missile attack on a military training camp in Yemen has killed at least 80 soldiers. Dozens of others have been wounded in the strike in the central province of Marib. The camp, about 170 kilometers east of the capital, Sana'a, targeted a mosque as people gathered for prayer. Yemen's government has blamed Houthi rebels for the attack, but there has been no claim of responsibility. Officials say they expect the death toll to continue to rise. Libya's warring rival factions are joining major powers in Germany in a renewed push to secure a ceasefire to halt the civil war. The talks follow the collapse of an earlier truce amid recriminations. The conflict pits powerful General Khalifa Haftar, who controls much of the east of Libya, against the UN-backed government in the capital. The summit also aims to extract a pledge from foreign powers to honor a UN arms embargo and to halt any further interference in the conflict. Forces loyal to General Haftar recently blocked oil exports from major ports, a blow to the country's main source of income. Libya has been in conflict since the 2011 uprising, which ousted longtime strongman Muammar Gaddafi. Next, and a state of emergency is being declared in Canada after severe snowstorms hit Newfoundland and Labrador. As much as 30 inches of snow has fallen, leaving some residents trapped in their own homes. The House of Lords, Britain's unelected second chamber, could leave London and move north as Prime Minister Boris Johnson considers plans to burst the Westminster bubble. York and Birmingham are the two cities being considered as the new location as part of a constitutional overhaul to be launched this spring that could also see the House of Commons go on tour. York is reportedly the most likely venue for a relocated upper chamber, as an area of disused government-owned land has already been identified. And finally, the threat of nuclear war may have hung over the Korean peninsula for years, but now the U.S. ambassador's mustache has got South Koreans bristling with anger. Harry Harris, a former Navy admiral who was born in Japan to a Japanese mother and an American Navy officer, has been accused of insulting his host by growing the adornment. His facial hair reminds many of the days of Japanese colonial rule between 1910 and 1945, during which all 8 Japanese governor-generals sported mustaches. Tokyo's rule over the Korean peninsula is a continuing source of resentment in South Korea, whose relations with its neighbor were damaged last year amid disputes over their wartime history. In an interview, the ambassador says he grew the mustache to mark his change in role, and added that he wanted to make a break between his life as a military officer and his new life as a diplomat. He says he couldn't grow taller or get any younger, but he could grow a mustache instead. Well, that's all for Sputnik News. I'm Emily Horn.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
So call us if you have a comment to make on anything that you've heard here this evening, or anything you think you ought to have heard here this evening. 02077 982 255 if you're in the United Kingdom. If you're in the United States, it's 001-757-744-4480. Or keep the tweets coming in at George Galloway and at RTUK News, as well as at GG Moats. We've got a second poll now for the last hour. What will Meghan and Harry do next? A, join the cast of The Crown. That's not a bad idea, by the way. B, Celebrity Big Brother? Don't do it. Take my advice. Or C, avoid the limelight. You can vote now on my Twitter feed at George Galloway. Now, on the subject of cast and films, I'm joined now by a man I've come to greatly admire. In a relatively short time, he has become a film and television star of note. And, moreover, he's done it as a Frenchman living in England, which doesn't happen often. To be fair, it doesn't often happen the other way around. There are not many big English stars in French media. But this is a man who's played King Arthur, for goodness sake. The legendary King Arthur, and not just once either. This is a man that's been in Doctor Who. A man that was watching Poldark, Series 1, and told his wife, if there's a Season 2, I'm going to be in it. As indeed he was in Poldark Series 3. He's appeared in a multitude now of really important films, some of which are now beginning to appear on the screen, or will be in the next few weeks. But he's not just an actor, he's an activist. And that's why I'm going to start talking to Guillaume Rivaud, not about art, not about film, but about politics, industrial politics. Because I'm watching, though most people are not, because I watch RT, but anyone watching any of the mainstream media don't even know what I'm talking about. I've watched millions of French people marching under the slogan of Macron, go, demit office. The French are giving a lesson to working class people all around the world of how never to give up your precious rights that you fought for and won. What is it about the French? Why are you so militant?
Good evening, George.
Good evening to you.
Thank you for having me on the show. This is great. Well, with regards to what's going on in France, you know, I've been in this country for 27 years. A lot of things have changed in France over the last 3 decades. You know, the political landscapes, the infrastructure, some of the laws and everything. But there is one thing, George, that will never change, ever. And that it is the spirit and the heart of the French people. You know, since many, many centuries, and probably look since the revolution in 1789. You know, there is a stigma about the French that they might be a little arrogant at times. You know, I won't go that far. I think that the French are very proud people. The French are very proud of their history. They're very proud of their culture. They're very proud of their way of life. But the French are very, as well, family-orientated, like a true Mediterranean kind of like a system. So if anything or anyone comes in between their way of life, or if the French, a French woman or a Frenchman feels threatened by an individual or by a system, then I believe that the French will do something about it.
Indeed, and it's almost breathtaking, the indefatigability of the French. 60 weeks the yellow vests have been out on the streets, and now there is a general strike of the whole working class against the neoliberal so-called reforms. I'm old enough to know when reforms used to be a good thing. Now they're a bad thing. If somebody says, I've got some reforms in mind, you can be sure they mean they're going to take something off you that you have already. They're going to change something against your interests. Most people in Germany, most people in Britain have accepted things over the last 3 decades that the French still absolutely regret. So I don't think the French are arrogant, but if they were, they'd have that to be arrogant about, to be proud about, that they stand up for their rights. And you're right, it's been going on for centuries. Let me ask you about this Macron, because he was briefly in the British media a kind of darling. He was shorter Tony Blair. He was coming to power with a new broom to sweep clean that which was wrong in France. He doesn't look so shiny today, does he? I mean, he was chased out of a theatre in Paris just 48 hours ago. What is it about him that gets up the goat of the French people so much?
Well, remember, during the election a couple of years back, I think it was a couple of years ago, I think that Emmanuel Macron went through because he was standing against Le Pen.
He was standing against a fascist.
Indeed.
What a choice, what a choice.
A choice, so that I think is the reason why he went through. And the honeymoon period is well truly over. And, you know, Macron represents, like you said before, the elite. And the French people, you know, they're hardworking people. And if, as an example, like we talk about the pension reforms right now, if someone works hard all of their life and they set themselves a target, and that target is that they're going to retire at the age of 62, and then someone like Emmanuel Macron could come along and says, you know what, I'm going to change everything and it's going to be 64, then they will say something about it.
Yeah, because they know that these kind of reforms have a sort of mission creep built into them. Once you've taken people's expected retirement away, what's your next reform? What are you going to force them to do or stop them from doing in the future? Let me ask you about the yellow vests. I know why the so-called mainstream media doesn't cover the yellow vests, because they don't want it spreading to other countries. But I don't know why the so-called left and so-called liberals and so-called progressives have also completely turned their back on a movement which for 60 weeks has been confronting not just neoliberal politics in the shape of Macron, but have been beaten, have been gassed, batoned, shot with rubber bullets, had their eyes knocked out, their limbs knocked off, and yet you don't get a word of support from the TUC here in Britain, from the Labour Party here in Britain, from the Guardian newspaper. Why is that?
Well, what's been happening over there has been absolutely shocking, to be honest with you. I remember tweeting some pictures of firefighters. You know, you know, these firefighters, they save people's lives. And you see these horrific pictures of firefighters fighting with cops. French cops in the streets. And, you know, with regards to what you were saying, look, if the way I look at it is if in France you'll have a French president that will be a socialist president in the mood of Jeremy Corbyn, or maybe in the mood of George Galloway. Yes.
Monsieur Mélenchon is my man. I love him.
Monsieur Mélenchon is a great guy, but if that would be the case, then the scenario would be completely different. And I think that you will see all of the things that are happening in France on all of the mainstream media.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, like you see the stuff that's going on in Hong Kong and Venezuela and Chile and Cuba, you know, and that would be happening in France. But there is, like you said earlier on, there is, you don't get to hear this on the mainstream media.
It's unbelievable.
Because the mainstream media, you know, who they are owned by and what the propaganda they're trying to give to people. Basically, they're feeding the populace what they want them to hear.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that this is the problem that we've got here, you know.
Now, look, I gave a hint of it earlier to the audience. You are genuinely a truly extraordinary man. You were not an actor, and you decided to be one. And you're not a teenager. You're not even in your 20s, but you decided, I'm going to be an actor. And now I can hardly switch on without seeing you. And I'm eagerly anticipating some of the films you've got in the pipeline. How does that work, that someone of your age who've had other careers, you say, I'm going to be on television, I'm going to make films. What kind of drive does that represent?
You need to have a special mindset. And you know, you're absolutely right. For your viewers to know how it happened for me is that I started acting at the age of 42. And I'm nearly 47 now. So I was watching Paul Dark season 1 on the television with my my wife, and then it just happened in my mind. I know I just had the click in my mind, and I said, look, if there is a season 2 of this, I'm in it. And 6 months later, I was filming season 2 in Charlestown, in the front of hundreds of people that were watching the show from up there, you know. And I wasn't really happy with the edit. So I said I'd be back in season 3. And in season 3 was great because I got to play the Vicomte de Sombreuil alongside all of the main cast. I was a friend of the Duchess. We got to rescue Dr. Ennis with Rose Poldark in France. It was a great thing. Yeah, it's...
See, I can see you as a Vicomte. But how did you get to be King Arthur?
Well, you know, I just got cast into the role, my friend. Maybe it's the look.
You do look kingly, I must say, yes.
Yeah, and it's funny because on Wednesday I'm doing another playlet for another King Arthur documentary, but I won't be playing King Arthur, I'm playing Lancelot, all in Shakespearean language, and we're filming that in the Southwest. You know, if you've got the opportunity to do a job, then you've got to do it. And it was a great honor to play King Arthur, like you just mentioned. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in 3 different
And Lancelot,
companies.
my goodness.
And Lancelot, that is happening on Wednesday, yes.
Now, there's 2 of your films in particular coming up. You were even in Trolley, which my wife totally loves. Trolley, by the way.
Okay.
But there's 2 of them I'm particularly looking forward to.
Okay.
One of them is Lawrence After Arabia. Now, Lawrence of Arabia is a very big historical figure. Not, I think, entirely understood by the mass of the people, though he was the subject of an epic David Lean film, Lawrence of Arabia, a long time ago now, more than 50 years ago now. But still not entirely understood properly. People know of his role in Arabia. What they don't know is Lawrence After Arabia. Without spoiling the film, give us a taster of what that's going to be about.
This is going to be a great movie. It's a labor of love from the wonderful director Mike Griffin that's been working on these projects for many years. And this film is going to focus on the last 2 years of T.E. Lawrence, and in particular it will focus on his death. Because as you know, George, T.E. Lawrence died unfortunately in a motorcycle crash.
Well, they say so, yes.
Well, this is what the film will focus on. You know, for the mainstream people, this is what happened. But then on the other hand, there is few bits of evidence here and there to say that maybe it could have been a job done by the security services at the time. And I think that this film is going to focus on this aspect. So you'll be able to see both sides of the story. Well, and they've got some wonderful cast as well in this movie. People like Hugh Fraser from Poirot. You see Michael Maloney as well. That is in that movie. The epilogue is Brian Cox. And the movie will come out in April 2020. And Mark, the director, really wanted that to happen during the 75th anniversary of the death of T.E. Lawrence.
I really can't wait for that, I must tell you. But the other project that's about to come out, Homeless Ashes, tell us about that.
This is again another fantastic project and another labor of love from another friend of mine called Mark Zammit that's literally worked on this project for the past 4 years. Young director, young actor, fantastic talent.
Huge following on social media too, Mark Zammit.
Huge following. He taught me a thing or two about social media over the last couple of years because that is it's a very important thing to do within the industry. But this Mark is a man that is a hardworking guy, but he's got vision, he's got a target, and within 2 years, he raised over £100,000 on a Twiller. You know, a bit like you had your project with the killing of Tony Blair's, when you had to do Indiegogo and Kickstarter campaigns. This is what he did, you know, with Homeless Ashes. And he raised over 100 grand for the movie. And he flew great actors from the United States to Britain. Leads like Lou Temple, that is a lead in The Walking Dead, in Halloween movies. He had Maria Howell from The Color Purple. And he got these people to come to Britain to film few scenes for the movie. And this is going to be a fantastic movie that focuses on 2 things. Number 1, homeless people obviously, it's kind of interlinked a little bit with austerity in the UK, what's been happening, the rise of homeless people in the streets, and also domestic abuse, domestic violence. And it's a story of young Frankie that just leaves home after a bad event that happened in his home, and he lives for 10, 15 years in the streets, and Frankie is actually played by Mark Zammit. And it's a very powerful drama. Very powerful drama. The producer is the wonderful Becca Guido. I'll be working with her and Mark Zammit again in 2021 in a very fantastic political period drama called Primrose. So we can talk about this later.
Yeah, of course. This is a remarkable life change for you at the age of 42. Now you've got a list of films and programs you're going to be in stretched out ahead of you. We're very lucky that you came here to practice that art, and I'm glad to say that leaving the European Union will never cut us apart. Guillaume, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows.
Thank you, George.
Really fantastic to see you. And if you've enjoyed that, you'll enjoy the interview that I did with Guillaume for our television show Sputnik on RT. What will Meghan and Harry do next? Join the cast of The Crown, 18%. Celebrity Big Brother, 36%. Avoid the limelight, 46%. I somehow can't see that myself. Now, you can vote on my Twitter feed at George Galloway. Let's take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, Keel Jones says, I give Craig Murray credit. George totally annihilates one of his points, and Craig just keeps on as if nothing happened. And Alan Harris says, when they lose, will they find another excuse to have another referendum? And Vaucluse Vanguard says, George, the SNP have failed in delivering basic services because they are dominated by socialists. Think about that, George. I will, but not for long, because it's absolute balderdash. NSPK77 says, I'm Belgian, and our history in the Congo is still woefully discussed in the education system or on the media. Shameful, I think you mean isn't discussed in the education system or the media. But don't worry about that, because you're not the only country that hides its imperial crimes. Mario says, George wants a unified Africa, ha ha ha, but hates the EU. Hypocrite, bro? Question mark? No. But I'll tell you what, Mario, Super Mario, here's my number, 02077 982 255. And I'll explain to you the difference between unity amongst the colonized and unity of the colonizers. I'll explain to you the difference between unity amongst the victims of empire and unity amongst the empire. Are you stupid, Mario? So call me. I'll educate you. 02077 982 255. Come and have a go, Mario, if you think you're hard enough. Washington Hoax says, I miss the old days when Iraq and Iran would kill each other off with no victory. That's probably from Henry Kissinger. Let's take a call from Paris. Stephanie on the line. Stephanie, welcome.
Hello, Mr. Galloway.
Nice to hear from you. Two French
thank
callers
you.
in a row. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been watching you for a while, and I love your show. It's really, really impressive what you're doing as a job, educating people. I know it's not easy at all.
Thank you.
Especially with the media, I mean, brainwashing people. I mean, I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you,
Stephanie. I want to go ahead directly to my question. I wanted to know, how do you read, I mean, in your opinion, the Iranian response to the killing of General Soleimani? Was it proportionate to the attack, to the initial attack? And why would the Iranian notify the Iraqi before doing such, I mean, before like attacking them? Do you really think they didn't want any casualties? And is this fair? Not that I want casualties, but do you think the response of the Iranian was really fair to the Iranian people?
It was definitely not proportionate. For it to be proportionate, Iran would have had to have cold-bloodedly killed someone of the status of General Soleimani. So the second man in the state of Iran, it would have to have been a pretty big target for it to have been proportionate. So the rest of us are quite lucky that the Iranians did not respond proportionately, because if they had, it's very likely that we'd be wearing tin helmets this evening whilst making this show, because the world would have been at war. I'm absolutely sure that the Iranians informed the Iraqis, and indeed others, in sufficient time for the Americans to withdraw their personnel and move their valuable assets away from a target that they knew was going to be hit, and that therefore face was saved on the Iranian side, just about, and on the American side in not carrying through the promise that Donald Trump made, and I quote it to you, that if any American base is hit by the Iranians in retaliation for the murder of General Soleimani, we will send, without hesitation, this is all a quote, some of our $2 trillion worth of shiny hardware flying towards Iran. So, in a way, Stephanie, we're quite lucky that the Iranians know a bit more about politics and diplomacy than Donald Trump does, don't you think?
I really think that it was diplomatic response, but they vowed revenge before. So do you think it was really a revenge response? No, I don't think so. It's like they didn't want this war at all. Like, they didn't want to avenge this. So I read it as if it's a weak response. I don't know. I don't want war. Of course I don't want war. This is not the purpose.
No.
But the way I see it, you know, the mass of people, the billions and billions of people in the street during the funerals of General Soleimani, I mean, if I was Iranian, I would say, what the hell? Is this the right response? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, on the 40th day, marking the 40th day since his murder, virtually the overwhelming majority of people in Iran will be on the streets again. And that will create another moment of real tension in relations between the United States and Iran. So my advice to the government of the United States is, before that 40th anniversary, start talking meaningfully and properly and with respect to the Iranian leadership. And let's try and resolve any outstanding problems between these two countries. Because if they don't, then it may be that the answer that was given will not be the final answer. Stephanie, thanks for the call. One woman caller, followed by another, and a legend at that. It's Lizzie in Gloucester. Lizzie, welcome.
Hi, George.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Nice to hear from you.
Oh, well, great. Congratulations for last night.
That was amazing.
I hear you had a full house.
It was a full house. In fact, there was touts trying to sell tickets at inflated prices outside. That's when you know you've really arrived.
Yeah, that's capitalism for you.
Thank you.
I was meanwhile doing a media conference with Chris Williamson and Dr. Bob Gill, whose film, The Great NHS Heist, was just, you know...
Stunning, yeah, stunning,
film.
absolutely,
it's a
yeah.
must-see film. Right, I wanted to talk to you about, what about this Tom Watson being elevated to the House of Lords?
I think it is an inexplicable betrayal by Jeremy Corbyn of the victims of Tom Watson, who include, and I have time only to give three. The victims of Tom Watson are the victims of the Carl Beach affair, when Watson, as a matter of deliberate policy, set forth the wolves on innocent people who had been falsely accused by a man, Carl Beach, who was himself the criminal that he was accusing other people of being. Secondly, amongst the victims of Tom Watson are the Palestinian people on whose graves Tom Watson has danced for decades. And thirdly, the British people who were robbed in 2017 of the possibility of a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn by the backstabbing treachery of the now Baron Tom Watson. No other Prime Minister or Leader of the Opposition would ever have put Watson into the House of Lords. So discredited an individual is he. But Jeremy Corbyn has now done so. And I think that Corbyn should be ashamed of himself. What do you think?
I think absolutely, absolutely. And I can't understand the entire narrative around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party has been portrayed so badly and so misleadingly, and Jeremy has at no point stood up and spoken out against it. Fair enough, he said.
And now he's ennobled the #1 practitioner of the big lie.
There you go. And look at Becca Long-Bailey is now supporting the Board of Deputies overseeing of the complaints process. How can you outsource the complaints process of the Labour Party? And nobody's asking the Conservative Party to agree to any pledges.
Unbelievable.
Absolutely.
Well, as I said earlier, Lizzie, it marks the moment when the Zen approach of Jeremy Corbyn morphed into actual masochism. He is asking his enemies to beat him and then rewarding them for doing so. Lizzie, thanks for that great call. Delita is in Manchester. Let's hear from Delita. Go ahead.
Hi, George. I was just wondering what you thought about the fact that Bernie Sanders has got people working for him that are using very fascist tactics.
Who's that?
He's got somebody really high up in his organisation that has been caught on Project Veritas, and it's been broadcasted over the internet and over social media.
I don't know anything about that, Delita. So tell us. Tell us.
I said that to your researcher earlier.
Yeah.
I said you might not know about it, but you can Google it.
So tell us. You've got the microphone now.
Okay, so there's this guy who does Project Veritas. Yeah.
What is that? What is Project Veritas?
It's like a truth-telling journalistic organisation.
A what?
Well, they tell the truth. They try and tell the truth. They bring out information that other people don't know. They do a lot of research and a lot of exposés.
And they have exposed people acting like fascists in Bernie's campaign. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you got any names or examples? Delita? Oh dear. We seem to have lost her. Has she gone? I wonder if that was a wind-up. Well, people will let us know. Mika Han says, let's not forget the very recent US overthrow of the duly elected democratic government of Bolivia by very much the same technique against Evo Morales as used against Patrice Lumumba. Quite so. Thank you, Mika. Zachariah says, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your devotion to truth and justice. I'd like to add that one of the most memorable moments during the run-up to the 1991 Iraq War was the speech in the House of Commons made by the late Right Honourable Tony Benn. In my view, He was the greatest politician of the last and this century, and like yourself, a defender for peace and truth. Carry on the fight. You have my support. Amen to all of that, Zachariah. The phone system has crashed, so my apologies to Delita. She was not winding me up. It's just that the phone's crashed. Alan Riley says, can George explain why he thinks he should have a say on Scottish independence when anyone who phoned his show saying they had left the UK but were pro-Remain, he told them they had no say and shouldn't have any say because they have left? George, you've left Scotland, so why do you think they shouldn't have a say but you should in the same circumstances? I don't know what you're talking about, Alan, but I'm going to solve your problem for you. I'm coming back. And you are going to have to deal with me. So put that in your Scottish nationalist pipe and smoke it. Let's see if we've got Delita back. Delita, welcome back. We're getting her now. We've still not got her. Alexander Riddle. Hello, George. I do hope you've heard of Nyerere. He fought for our independence here in Tanzania and helped us gain it through peaceful means from the British Empire. He is our hero here in Tanzania. I have realized you have a lot in common with him. One, he was a socialist. But the most important thing that connects you with him is the fact that you both hate disintegration of regions and countries that speak the same language. So don't give up. The unification of Britain is imperative for the success of both the British and the Scottish people. Thank you, Alexander. Not only do I know of Nyerere, I met him and was very proud to do so. Delita's back. My apologies, Delita. I thought you'd hung up, but it was the system that crashed. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah,
Give us some examples of what you're talking about.
Well, not really examples, but so much as if I tell you to actually just look up Project Veritas. The guy who runs it is quite acclaimed. Like, he's never had a retraction. Like, WikiLeaks has never had anyone come and say you're wrong.
Okay, but what, because I can't do that, because I'm on the air at the moment, and neither can the people who are listening, give us some idea about this fascist behaviour by Bernie's people.
So the guy, I'm not saying it's Bernie's fault either. Maybe, he's very high up in the organisation because he's like Bernie, yeah? And these guys just work for him. So maybe that he has no idea that they're doing this. It's like Antifa. They say they're anti-fascist, yet they use fascist tactics. And people support them. And the people who support them tend to be the media who support the government, who also, like Extinction Rebellion, the government support them as well. So it tells me that the government want all this to happen.
I feel you, but I'm still no wiser as to what kind of things these people are doing. Can you not give us even a hint of that?
Okay, well, let's put it this way, right? Tomorrow's the 21st, yeah? Stop it, Alishka. Sorry, that's my daughter. Stop it. Right, tomorrow something is going to happen. Not going to happen necessarily, but people are very worried about something happening tomorrow because there's a big, Second Amendment right thing going on in America.
Is that these armed militia people that are marching on the Capitol?
They're not armed militia. They're people who are exercising their Second Amendment rights under their Constitution.
To be an armed militia. To be an armed militia.
Well, actually, it kind of is that, isn't it? Because when they all got these amendments...
That's what the amendment says. That the American people, the American people have a right to bear arms as a militia.
And defend themselves from foreign and domestic enemies.
Yeah. So I'm inferring you're a strong supporter of that amendment, are you?
Well, I'm not American. I'm English, but I know that we used to have that right ourselves before certain things happened in this country.
Do you think we should again?
I think that if people knew that if something bad happened, somebody would have, be able to take instant justice, like what is true natural justice. That maybe so many bad things wouldn't happen, because you cannot depend on the government to defend you.
Well, I was in Dunblane yesterday, and your argument wouldn't cut much.
And that's what happened.
Your argument wouldn't cut much mustard there.
That changed everything here. That happened. That was the incident that happened that changed our rights and our
you
constitution.
call it an incident.
And all that
I call it the mass murder of a lot of small children in a school.
Crazy person, yeah. By one crazy person, and then every person who wasn't crazy, who didn't kill anyone, got their right to defend themselves taken away.
That crazy person, if he hadn't had the right to bear arms and bore several of them, all those children would still be alive.
Yeah, and and how many people have died since then because other people have not had the right to defend themselves?
Okay, Delita, I get you. Thank you very much indeed for calling back, especially. Let's go to another Sanders critic. Chris in Colchester. Go ahead, Chris.
Hiya.
Hi.
Yeah, well, I just think the thing about the sexism stuff is a bit of a red herring. I mean, I don't really care, to be honest, whether he's a sexist or not. I mean, he co-sponsored the bill to invade Libya, which I think is just unforgivable, along with what Hillary Clinton's involvement and the French. And, you know, if you look at his record, he's more hawkish than Obama was before he became president, and look how that turned out.
Who are you backing yourself, Chris?
Well,
who are you rooting for?
Tulsi Gabbard is the best of the worst. You know, that's how politics is, I'm afraid. No one's perfect.
Quite so. I'll quit while I'm ahead on that one. And when Tulsi Gabbard endorses Bernie Sanders, as I assure you she will you endorse him too?
Never, because he shouldn't be forgiven for his warmongering. And, you know, what you don't forgive Tony Blair, do you? Anthony Blair or Clinton. I don't know why you forgive Bernie so easily.
I forgive him. I forgive him to this extent. He opposed the Iraq War. He opposed the Vietnam War. He opposes the war against Iran. He stands up for the blue-collar working class in the United States of America, and he has a chance to win. His imperfections, his shortcomings, his failures, even his crimes, have to be forgiven in the context that he is the best candidate who can possibly win the presidency of the United States. That's my position. Chris, it's not that hard to understand, really, is it?
Well, he's happy to support wars when the Democrats are in power. He's against them when Republicans are in power. So he's a company man.
No, that's manifestly untrue because
it's not.
He got arrested opposing the Democrat war against the people of Vietnam. So you've fallen at the first hurdle. You've fallen at the first war that he opposed.
That was a long time ago. I'm looking at his record. Well, it was.
A long time ago.
He voted against the Iraq War, but then he voted to fund it when the Democrats were in power. He was fine when Obama.
Sure. I understand your point of view, and that point of view guarantees that we'll get Donald Trump for another 4 years. Good luck to you.
I know. I don't want Trump. I don't want Trump either.
But you're rubbishing the one guy who has a chance of beating him.
But Sanders
Where's that at?
Sanders gave 1.5 trillion to Lockheed Martin. He's not much of a blue worker, man, is he? He doesn't care. He keeps on going about corporations. He's helped Lockheed Martin to bomb people. He's a fraud, I think. And
a fraud.
Trump,
a fraud.
I think he's I don't like him. I think he's worse than Trump.
Really? So Chris in Colchester thinks Bernie Sanders is worse than Trump. He is the pure blue flame, is Chris. Let's go to Maryland and talk to Nestor. Nestor, welcome.
Oh, hi, George. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Go ahead.
I'm enjoying the conversations that's going on right now with Tulsi and against Bernie and all this division that's going on. You know, I think that's all set to, try to stop Bernie Sanders. Like we saw in the last CNN debate, we saw how blatantly they were against him. They were just attack. And I'm gonna have a prediction that when Bernie Sanders wins the nomination, I bet you CNN will be on Trump's side attacking Bernie Sanders. And then I'm just wondering, how Trump supporters are going to react to that.
Well, that's
knowing that now the establishment.
That's going to be very hard for CNN to do, because actually CNN exists for really only one purpose, and that is to attack Donald Trump, isn't it? So how could they turn around and support him because the Democrats have picked Bernie Sanders?
Well, like you saw Pelosi herself said that there would never be socialism in America. You have to understand, George, that there is some there is even people that are supposedly centrist, not fully right. There's just some weird thing with the word socialism and this weird fear of Bernie Sanders, and I think a lot of it has to do with that. You know, a lot of people want to talk that Bernie isn't anti-war enough. Well, I think Bernie is the most anti-war candidate, and I think when the moment that Bernie Sanders becomes president and he gets the brief on the agenda of the empire, he's going to want to put an immediate stop to that, and that's something that the establishment knows, and they don't want to see that at all. They don't even want to give that a chance. So I guarantee you that even CNN will back Trump against Bernie.
Well,
mark my words.
I have marked them, and we'll talk again at the very least after the election has taken place. Nestor in Maryland, thank you for that. Alex is in Reading in England. Go ahead, Alex.
Hello, George. How are you doing?
Good. By the grace of God, I'm fighting fit. Go ahead.
I'm glad you opened by saying the grace of God. So just out of curiosity and my own political inclination, I was thinking that the U.S. administration faced with this challenge with Iran, and they have a clear target they would like to eliminate, whether it's arrest, kill, however they're going to go about it. We don't know, because Trump went straight ahead and killed him, ordered the drone strike. How would you have suggested the administration go about it, pending all the sanctions and all the Strait of Hormuz incident and the incidents that happened at the Aramco Saudi oil?
Alex, I'm amazed at the premise of your question. First of all, General Soleimani was a war hero, not just a war hero for the Iranian people, but he ought to be a war hero for all of us who oppose the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, fanatic extremism, because he was the hammer of this fanatic extremism. He took out more ISIS and Al-Qaeda forces and fighters than anyone else in the world. And so the number one beneficiary of the murder of Soleimani is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They were the ones celebrating in the streets. Number two, Soleimani was an accredited diplomat with a diplomatic passport who had entered an allied country, Iraq, our allied country, Iraq, on a diplomatic passport from a commercial flight, going through passport control absolutely normally, and was on his way, according to the Prime Minister of our ally Iraq, to deliver a message from the Iranian government in response to a Saudi-Iraqi peace initiative. So the killing of Soleimani was a dastardly crime, as well as a blunder of enormous magnitude. And we will not see the end of this story for a very long time. Alex, I need to clear you off the line because there's a legend. There's a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
How lovely to hear your voice.
Well, this program is focusing my mind because my husband's in hospital.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
He's got lots of health complications and fever, diabetes, kidneys. So this program is concentrating on mine.
Good.
Now, the thing is, Lizzie spoke earlier about what I was going to say. Nominating Tom Watson to the House of Lords. And I mean, really, I call him like mild-mannered Jeremy. He's wrong. And this is remarkable, really, that he even thought about that. I don't really understand it. know?
And he hasn't explained it, I suppose, because no explanation really exists beyond this kind of craven masochism which seems to have taken grip of him. There can be absolutely no justification for Jeremy Corbyn to put Tom Watson into the House of Lords and back into British politics. You see, if he'd been just Mr. Watson running his gym and his diet company, then you might never have heard of him again, Norma. But believe me, as Lord Watson, you'll be hearing plenty of him.
Well, the thing I do like, though, I don't know what you think, is I quite like for Deputy Leader Richard Bergen.
Richard Bergen is a very fine man. He should have run for leader. He's 10 times better than Rebecca Loyerly-Bailey, and he would have a better chance to win than she does. As it happens, as the main opposition to the Taylor's dummy Keir Starmer, Loyerly-Bailey just doesn't cut it. But Bergen is an outstanding, excellent
I
fellow.
like him.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have my way, and this is just sheer silliness, my Prime Minister would be Abby Martin.
Yes, I'm in favour of that. Let's elect Abby Martin as the leader of the mother of all talk shows. Norma, God bless your husband, strengthen him and return him to health. I'm sure that the thoughts of all of our viewers and listeners are with you as you cope with his absence in hospital, and please don't be a stranger to us. Poll 2 has closed. What will Meghan and Harry do next? A, join the cast of The Crown, 15%. It's not a bad call, that, you know. B, Celebrity Big Brother, a very bad call, 35%. C, avoid the limelight, 50%. I'm amazed that half of you think that Meghan and Harry are going to disappear from view. I'm truly amazed at that. Slowpoke says America makes war with Muslim countries, and where are they going to flee? To Europe, of course. You should be angry at the US. Alan says Scotland don't want independence if they want to go into the EU. How does that make sense? Exactly, Alan. You want to leave a union, a democratic union, in which you have a considerable say, in which you are actually now occupying many of the commanding heights in business, in the media, in politics, in government, in the civil service, who speak your language, and you want to leave it, and you want to join a union that speaks 100 languages, none of which are yours, with whom you have absolutely no common history, culture, or economic interest, and which, above all, has absolutely no democracy within it. How is that independence? Washington Hoax says if Scotland went independent, they'd be dependent on the EU. All those whiskey distilleries will be making wine. Ha ha. And Garden Gnome says, as an American, it would be a good idea to turn Frogmore into a McDonald's. And Lessons for Life says, I liked the House of Lords, but it was a bit barbaric at times, especially when they ganged up on the boy with glasses. I don't know what that means. Rob says, move the House of Lords to Tehran. Not a bad idea. Tony says, the best suggestion I've heard for a second chamber is to make it like jury service. Every election, select representatives randomly from each constituency. Complex court cases are heard by ordinary people, so legislation could be understood by ordinary people. Ron says, George, the House of Lords should be sent to South Georgia. And I'm not talking about the USA. Tony says, when Corbyn was a backbencher, he either proposed or supported a motion to discuss the Bradbury Pound. When he became leader, he never mentioned it again. Jeff in Glasgow says, whilst I agree there are elements of the media that are racist, I genuinely believe that the criticism towards Meghan is fair and not racism. The fact that she has had huge issues with her own family, that she got exposed as being a hypocrite regarding her environmental preaching, yet using private jets, and the fact that she's used taxpayers' money to fund her extravagant lifestyle are all valid points to criticize her. That's from Jeff in Glasgow. Eddie Milligan says, well done for the way you dealt with that caller from Canada. My wife and I were in Auschwitz and Birkenau a week or so back, and it was very clear that the Nazis were determined to exterminate all Jews and other minorities when they had achieved that. On Scottish independence, as an Irishman, I cannot tell the Scots they can't have independence if the majority want it. Thank you for that, Eddie. The majority didn't want it. If they now do, they must have it. But there will be a battle royal. There will be a Donnybrook in Scotland over the issue of Scottish independence. And I put the nationalists on notice right now. I have joined the fray, and I'm not going to go away until your plan to break up this small island is finally defeated. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time and the same place and bring another viewer, another listener with you, because I'm on the trail of 2 million viewers for the mother of all talk shows. Thanks for joining me.